Alright, so have you heard about the candy crime wave that took Japan by storm in the 80s? It sounds like something out of a crime novel, but this was very real. The whole ordeal centers around a group calling themselves the Monster with 21 Faces, and the chaos they stirred up went way beyond just candy. Let's dive into the story because it's got it all. Kidnapping, ransom demands, poison threats, and a mystery that still baffles people today. So, the story kicks off in March 1984. Picture this. Katsuhisa Izaki, the head of a big candy company called Izaki Glico, is relaxing in the bath at his home in Osaka. It's a quiet night, until it's not. Out of nowhere, two armed, masked men burst into his house, pull him right out of the bath, and kidnap him. Imagine the shock. He's taken from his own home with no time to even get dressed. The next day, a ransom note shows up. These kidnappers demand a lot, 1 billion yen and 100 kilograms of gold. That's around $10 million today, and they give very specific instructions about where and how they want it delivered. It's clear these people have a plan, and they know what they're doing. But here's where things take a twist. Before Izaki's family or his company can even figure out if they'll pay the ransom, Izaki makes a break for it. 2 days into his captivity, he somehow manages to loosen his bindings and escape. There's one account that makes it sound like something straight out of a thriller movie. It's still dark, and he's tied up, but he gets himself loose, breaks down the door of this isolated warehouse they've stashed him in, and stumbles upon some railroad workers who help him call the police. Just imagine the relief, right? He's free, but he has no idea who the kidnappers were or why he was targeted. So at this point, you'd think the whole ordeal is over. But no, the kidnappers, or should I say the criminals, aren't done yet. They're about to take this crime spree to a whole new level. The people behind this weren't ready to just let it go because their kidnapping plan fell through. Soon after, they regroup and decide to get money another way. They send a new demand to Izaki's company, Glico, this time threatening something terrifying. They claim they'll lace Glico candies with cyanide if they don't get paid about $480,000. Just to prove they're serious, they somehow sneak into Glico's headquarters and set parts of the building on fire. Talk about a wake-up call. At this point, everyone's in a panic. Glico starts pulling their products off store shelves. They're facing potential disaster, and the public's already on edge. The police are trying to get a handle on this, but they just keep coming up empty. Here's where things get even more intense, though. Back in the 1980s, Japanese police were known for solving almost every case they got. In fact, in 1983, they solved over 97% of murder cases and more than half of theft cases. But this Glico case, it's turning out to be a whole new level of difficult, and the police just can't seem to make progress. Pretty soon, the criminals start getting cocky. They're taunting the police openly. On April 8th, the press gets a letter, the first of many to come. This letter doesn't just taunt the police, it mocks them. To the stupid police, it begins, as if to say, "Are you even trying?" They call the police idiots and suggest that if they were really professionals, they'd have caught the criminals by now. And then, almost as if they want to prove they're the ones in control, they drop hints about the case, like where they got their supplies and what kind of car they're driving. It's like they're saying, "Catch us, if you can." These letters don't stop either. Over the next year and a half, they send over 100 letters to the police and media, each one filled with clues, or at least they seem like clues. They give all kinds of random details, like what factory gate they entered through, or the make of the typewriter they used. But no matter what, these hints lead nowhere. It's as if they're setting up a game that only they know how to play. This whole approach earned them the nickname Gekijo Hanzai, which means crime as theater, because they seem to be staging everything for the drama of it. Then, in June, the group starts calling themselves the Monster with 21 Faces. It's a nod to an old Japanese detective story by Edogawa Rampo, where the villain is this master thief who taunts the police and disguises himself so well that he could be anyone. This wasn't just some random nickname, it was a perfect fit. Like the character, These criminals were constantly one step ahead of the police, openly mocking them and daring them to keep up. It was clear that whoever these people were, they had a fascination with mischief and mystery. But their threats weren't just limited to Glico. By September, they set their sights on another candy giant, Morinaga and Company. Morinaga received letters demanding nearly $500,000, and when they refused to pay, the threats got darker. On October 8th, Japanese newspapers received a letter that sent chills down people's spines. It was addressed to moms throughout Japan. In the letter, the group claimed they'd laced Morinaga's candy with cyanide and warned parents to check for special labels on the packages. And here's the terrifying part. The very same day, stores across Japan started finding packages of candy labeled Danger, Cyanide. Even though not all of these packages tested positive for poison, at least one had a lethal dose. Thanks to the warnings, no one actually ate the poisoned candy, but the fear was real. People didn't know if they could trust anything on store shelves anymore. In the aftermath, the police launched a massive operation. We're talking 40,000 officers stationed in grocery stores across the country, watching and waiting. But despite the numbers, nothing came of it. And it seemed like the monster with 21 faces knew the police's every move. They were just always one step ahead. The police did catch one potential break, though. Surveillance footage from a store on October 7th showed a man with permed hair, glasses, and a baseball cap placing something on a shelf where the poisoned candy was later found. They called him Bideo no Otoko, or Video Man. The footage, however, was grainy and almost unusable, and despite releasing his image to the public, they never tracked him down. Then there's another strange detail. Some phone calls were made by the monster with 21 faces to coordinate ransom drops, and they released recordings of these calls. The twist? The voices in these recordings weren't just some tough guy criminals. They included a woman's voice and even a child's voice giving instructions. At one point, you can hear the child saying to leave the money behind the seat of the bus stop bench. It's creepy to imagine. These faceless criminals aren't just a bunch of thugs. Who are they? A family? A group with kids involved? It only added to the mystery. By early 1985, the monster with 21 faces had harassed 31 food and candy companies, and still, no one had a clue who they were. At times, companies even tried to pay up, but the monster always seemed to know when it was a setup. In one instance, they even mocked the plainclothes officers by calling them out for their shifty eyes and pretending to be businessmen. It was like they were taunting the police just for the fun of it. Then, out of nowhere, it all stopped. On August 12, 1985, the monster with 21 faces sent one final letter saying they were done. Just like that. The letter came a year and a half after their crime spree began, and after they'd managed to send Japan's National Police Agency through the ringer, deploying over 130,000 officers in a wild goose chase that turned up absolutely nothing. So who were they? Over the years, a few theories have come up, but none of them have been proven. Theory 1, the inside job. Some people think that Katsuhisa Ezaki himself, the candy exec who was first kidnapped, might have been involved. The idea is that his escape seemed almost too perfect. But this theory doesn't hold up well. Ezaki's company lost a ton of money because of this, and they actually had to shut down production temporarily. So, if this was a publicity stunt, it was a terrible one. Theory 2, revenge against the candy industry. There's another theory that the group might have had a vendetta against the Japanese food industry. Back in 1955, a tragedy occurred when a stabilizer in Morinaga's powdered milk was contaminated with arsenic. Thousands of infants were affected, and many died. Decades later, survivors of this tragedy might have harbored some deep resentment. By 1984, they would have been in their late 20s or early 30s, possibly seeking revenge. But while it sounds plausible, there's no solid proof linking the monster to this incident. And Theory 3, the fox-eyed man. The most promising lead came when the police almost captured someone they called the fox-eyed man during a ransom stakeout in Kyoto. The man got away, but the police found a stolen car he'd been using, complete with a police scanner inside. After they released a sketch, people identified him as Manabu Miyazaki, a known criminal from a Yakuza family. Even Miyazaki's own mother thought the sketch looked just like him. But here's the kicker. Miyazaki had an alibi, and there was no hard evidence to connect him to the case. Years later, Miyazaki even wrote a memoir with that same police sketch on the cover, right after the statute of limitations on the case expired. He admitted to other crimes, but kept quiet on anything related to the monster with 21 faces. And strangely, that book made him about as much money as the monster demanded in ransom. Coincidence? The monster with 21 faces remains a mystery, a shadowy figure in the annals of unsolved crime. Whoever they were, they exposed a vulnerability in Japan's crime-fighting system. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, humiliation, and an insatiable love for the spotlight. They changed Japan's candy industry, drove companies to the edge, and even led to a decline in candy sales nationwide. But despite all this, no one has ever come forward. No one has claimed responsibility, even with the statute of limitations long past. Maybe the monster was an organization, a family, a grudge-holding mastermind. Maybe they were just playing a game. I've often thought it could have been someone in the police force or worked close to them, at least because they were always just one step ahead and seemed to know exactly what the police were doing. One thing's for sure, they knew exactly how to hold a nation's attention and keep people guessing, even decades later. Alright, so let's talk about George Reeves, the guy who brought Superman to life on TV for the first time. You know the type. Square jaw, perfect hair, and that big classic Hollywood smile. George was the original Superman, the face of the Man of Steel for a generation of kids in the 1950s. But his real life was, well, let's just say, way more complicated than anything his super alter ego faced on screen. Fame came with its own price, and what happened in the end? Well, let's just say there are more questions than answers. So George was born George Kiefer Brewer on January 5, 1914, in Woolstock, Iowa, a tiny little town most people have probably never heard of. His childhood wasn't exactly sunshine and roses. His parents split up while he was still a baby, and his mom, Helen, remarried to a guy named Frank Besselo. George took his stepdad's last name and grew up as George Besselo for a while. But then, Helen and Frank's marriage fell apart too. George's life was kind of rocky early on. He and his mom were always moving around, and he didn't have that stable family life that a lot of us would want. When he was about 15, George and his mom settled in Pasadena, California. Now, moving to California turned out to be a good thing for him. He was one of those kids who was just naturally talented at a lot of things. He was a musician, he boxed a bit, and he was into acting. He ended up at the Pasadena Playhouse, which was a pretty big deal. It was one of those places where future Hollywood stars were being trained, and George was good enough to stand out. One day, a Warner Brothers casting director spotted him, and just like that, he was on the path to Hollywood. So George's big break came with a small role in Gone with the Wind. Yep, Gone with the Wind. It was just a small part, but what a movie to be a part of. A true Hollywood classic. You'd think that would be a huge boost to his career, right? Well, yes, and no. George did get some roles in the early 1940s, but they were mostly supporting parts. Hollywood was interested in him, but he wasn't the leading man yet. Then, he got a solid role in a movie called So Proudly We Hail in 1943. It's one of those patriotic World War II movies, and George really got to show some chops there. People started talking about him as a potential star. But just as things seemed to be picking up, the world had other plans. The war broke out, and George, like a lot of young actors, joined the military. He served his time and put his acting career on hold. When the war ended, George returned to Hollywood. It was a different game. Some actors managed to jump right back into stardom, but for George, it wasn't that easy. Hollywood wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for him. He did some minor film roles, but his career just wasn't taking off the way he hoped. Around this time, he started looking at television, which was still pretty new but rapidly growing. He wasn't getting anywhere on the big screen, so he figured, why not give TV a shot? Then, in 1952, George got the role that would define his life: Superman in Adventures of Superman. This was big. I mean, it's hard to overstate how popular Superman was with kids back then. George was suddenly everywhere, flying across screens every week, fighting bad guys, leaping tall buildings, and being, well, Superman. But here's the thing, TV wasn't like it is now. It wasn't nearly as profitable for actors. George was reportedly making something like $200 an episode in the beginning, which was decent money back then, but nowhere near the kind of cash you'd expect for being the face of a household hero. And then there was another issue. He became too famous as Superman. To everyone watching, George wasn't George anymore. He was Superman, the Man of Steel. And because of that, he started having a hard time landing any other roles. Imagine this, you're a trained actor. You want to do all kinds of roles, but now every time you go to an audition, the producers just see Superman. Nobody wanted to hire him for anything else. It wasn't like today, where superhero roles can actually boost an actor's career. Back then, comic books and TV were considered kind of lowbrow, and Hollywood didn't take them seriously. At first, George enjoyed the fame, but it wasn't long before he realized he was trapped. He had to wear that costume for public appearances. And there's this one story that shows how weird things got. During one of these events, a little boy came up to him with a loaded gun. Yeah, a real gun. And wanted to see if bullets really bounced off Superman. George had to think fast, so he told the kid that yes, bullets would bounce off, but they'd ricochet and hit the other people in the crowd. Luckily, the kid believed him and put the gun away. It's kind of funny, but also sad, because it shows how deeply George was tied to this character he couldn't escape. Now, while all this was going on, George had a pretty complicated personal life. He'd been in a serious relationship with a woman named Toni Mannix. And here's where it gets juicy. Toni was married to Eddie Mannix, a powerful fixer for MGM Studios. Eddie Mannix was a guy you didn't want to cross. He handled problems for Hollywood stars, and rumors say he was connected to some pretty dangerous people. Despite being married to Eddie, Toni and George were together for years, and Eddie apparently didn't mind, or at least pretended not to. There were even stories of Eddie joining Toni and George on vacations, bringing his own girlfriend along. It was a strange setup, but George and Toni were genuinely close, and she supported him emotionally and financially. She paid for his car, his house, pretty much his lifestyle. George was very much a kept man. But in the late 1950s, George met Leonore Lemon, a New York socialite with a reputation for her fiery temper. George and Leonore had a whirlwind romance, and soon rumors of an engagement started floating around. This did not go over well with Toni. She was heartbroken, devastated, maybe even a little vengeful. There's even a story that she took George's dog just to hurt him emotionally after the breakup. Now here's where things get really strange. It's June 15, 1959, and George and Leonore are out on the town. They come back to George's house around 11 p.m., and soon after, a few people show up, a writer named Robert Condon and two other guests, William Bliss and Carol Van Ronkel. It's pretty late, and George doesn't seem thrilled about having company. He's tired, probably had a few drinks, and he eventually heads upstairs to bed. Then, not long after, there's a gunshot. Bliss is the one who rushes upstairs and finds George's body. George is lying on his bed, naked, with a gunshot wound to his right temple. There's a gun on the floor between his feet and a bullet hole in the ceiling where the shot went through. It looks like a suicide. Or does it? The police quickly ruled it a suicide. But even right from the start, people had questions. There's actually 3 different theories. So let's look at the suicide theory first. George was struggling with some things. His career was stalled, he was frustrated, and he'd been drinking a lot. Friends say he was in a pretty dark place. And yeah, he was Superman to millions, but inside he felt trapped in a role he'd outgrown. It's easy to imagine him feeling hopeless. But here's the catch. He actually had some new opportunities coming up. Rumors say he was being considered for a part in Hitchcock's Psycho, which could have been a huge break. Then there's Leonore's behavior. Just before George went upstairs, she reportedly told everyone, "He's going to kill himself." Then when they heard the drawer open, she added, "He's getting the gun." It's eerie and kind of suspicious, but when later asked about this by the police, she replied, "I was just joking." Now, I don't know about you, but it seems like a strange thing to joke about, right? Then there's the theory that it was an accidental shooting. Now, this one's a little more out there, but bear with me. Leonore was known for her temper, and maybe the two of them were arguing. Some people think she grabbed the gun, maybe intending to scare him or just out of anger, and it went off by accident. Afterward, they all panicked and came up with a suicide story to cover it up. And here's a weird little detail. 2 other bullets were found in the floor. Leonore said she accidentally fired them while messing around with the gun. So the police didn't seem to think this was relevant to the case, which is just bizarre to me. And then there's the murder theory, and this is where it gets dark. Some people think Eddie Mannix was involved. Remember, Eddie was powerful and connected, and he wasn't the kind of guy you crossed lightly. Maybe Tony was devastated by George leaving her, and Eddie decided to fix the situation. Or maybe Tony arranged it on her own, using Eddie's connections. There's a pretty chilling piece of evidence supporting this theory. Shortly after George's death, Tony called one of his friends and said, "The boy is dead. He's been murdered." And she was serious. Years later, publicist Edward Lazzi, who knew Tony in her later years, claimed he witnessed her confessing to a priest. According to Lazzi, Tony admitted that she and Eddie had George killed, and she was terrified of going to hell because of it. Lazzi stayed quiet for years, fearing for his own safety, which makes you wonder, right? So, what really happened? Honestly, every theory has its problems. If it was suicide, why did so many details feel off? If it was an accident, could everyone really keep the story straight under pressure? And if it was murder, the way the room was situated and had no windows, that would mean slipping past 4 people without anyone noticing. Or maybe some of them were in on it? Personally, I think George's story is one of those mysteries we'll never fully unravel. He was a guy who became a legend, but he paid a steep price for it. People loved Superman, but they forgot about George, the man behind the cape. Whether he died by his own hand, by accident, or by something darker, his story leaves us with questions that might never be answered. And maybe that's fitting in a way. The man who played Superman was, in the end, only human. But what do you think? I would love to hear your theories. So picture this, it's New Orleans, 1918. The city is full of life, music pouring out of clubs, people enjoying that rich southern culture. But then something happens that sends shockwaves through the whole area, a series of brutal murders that come out of nowhere. People start hearing rumors of a mysterious figure breaking into homes at night and attacking sleeping victims. And the tool of choice? An axe. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans, a figure who haunted the city and nearby areas for about 18 months, leaving a trail of fear and bodies. It's like something out of a horror movie. The Axeman didn't just strike randomly. He seemed to pick his moments and his methods carefully, and the city was left constantly on edge. So let's break down what happened during that strange and terrifying time. The nightmare begins on May 23, 1918, with the attack on Joseph and Catherine Maggio, a couple living in New Orleans. Joseph and Catherine were attacked while they were sleeping in their bed, and it wasn't just any attack. Whoever did this was brutal. Catherine's throat was cut so deeply she was nearly decapitated, and Joseph was hacked multiple times with an axe. They were discovered by Joseph's brothers, who lived nearby. Can you imagine stumbling upon something like that? What's strange is that there was no forced entry, nothing was stolen, and the only sign of disturbance was a panel knocked out of the kitchen door. Oh, and the murder weapon? Just an axe that belonged to the Maggios, left right there at the scene. And this pattern would become the axeman's calling card. He never brought his own weapons. only used whatever he found in his victims' homes. The randomness of it all, ordinary people attacked in their beds with their own tools, just made it more chilling. Less than a month later, another attack rocked the community. This time it was Louis Bessumer and his lover, Anna Lowe, who were attacked in their home on June 28, 1918. Louis survived, but Anna succumbed to her injuries weeks later. The way it happened was eerily similar to the Maggio attack. The attacker slipped into the home, used a weapon found on site, an axe once again, and slipped away without being caught. Anna described her attacker as a large white man with a hatchet, but that was as much detail as anyone could get. The city was already on edge, and it didn't help that there seemed to be no clear motive. The axeman didn't steal, he didn't seem to target wealthy people, and there was no pattern to the attacks except the violence and the choice of weapon. Then on August 5, 1918, Mrs. Ed Schneider was attacked in her home while she was 7 months pregnant. Amazingly, she survived and even gave birth a week after the attack. But 5 days later, on August 10th, 80-year-old Joseph Romano was found fatally injured by his nieces. They saw a dark, heavy-set man with a slouch hat leaving the scene. And while this might have been a glimpse of the axeman, no one could say for sure. At this point, the fear was palpable. The New Orleans press reported on armed citizens patrolling their neighborhoods, guarding their families through the night. Police were on high alert, pouring resources into solving this case, but still, they couldn't find a single solid lead. And for a while, the attacks stopped. But just as things were starting to settle, the axeman struck again, bringing with him a dark twist that would take the city's fear to a whole new level. The axeman resurfaced on March 10, 1919, 7 months after the last known attack. He attacked the Cortimiglia family, brutally injuring both Rose and Charles Cortimiglia, and tragically killing their 2-year-old daughter, Mary. And in classic axeman style, the weapon was an axe that belonged to the Cortimiglias. 5 days later, New Orleans was rocked by something totally unexpected. A letter to the Times-Picayune, allegedly written by the axeman himself. The letter, dated Hell, March 13, 1919, was filled with taunts, threats, and strange boasts. The writer claimed he wasn't human at all, but a fell demon from hottest hell, and he mocked the police's efforts to catch him. It was theatrical, almost surreal. But here's the kicker. The axeman claimed he had a fondness for jazz and warned that on the night of March 19th, he would spare anyone who was playing jazz music in their homes. The message was clear: jazz it or get the axe. It was an insane, spine-chilling threat, a killer telling an entire city to throw a party or risk his wrath. The letter even inspired a jazz song called Don't Scare Me, Papa, or The Axeman's Jazz, and that night, March 19th, jazz music filled the air all over New Orleans. People cranked up their phonographs, danced, and flocked to jazz clubs just to be safe. And, believe it or not, no one was killed that night. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe the axeman was just toying with the city. Either way, he kept his word. After the infamous jazz night, the axeman continued his attacks, though the frequency dropped off. On August 10, 1919, a man named Steve Boca was attacked while he slept but managed to escape. Later that year, 19-year-old Sarah Lahman was also attacked but survived, though she couldn't remember the details. Then, on October 27, 1919, the axeman struck what's believed to be his last time, killing Mike Pepitone. His wife, Esther, reported seeing 2 figures fleeing the scene, but it was too dark to identify them. This is where the trail goes cold. So who was the axeman? Theories abound, each more complex and haunting than the last. One theory suggests that not every attack attributed to the axeman was actually his doing. The attacks weren't entirely consistent. Different witness descriptions, slightly different methods, and maybe even different motives. The killing of Mike Pepitone, for instance, is thought by some to be a mafia hit, possibly connected to a past killing by his father. Some even believe that the axeman's reign of terror inspired copycats who used the fear surrounding the original attacks to mask their own crimes. Now this one's a bit out there, but it has its followers. The letter's eerie language, The references to being a demon from hottest hell and his seeming ability to slip in and out of houses unnoticed led some to think of the Axeman as something other than human. Maybe he was some kind of supernatural being, able to pass through walls and strike without being seen. It sounds wild, but in a city like New Orleans, with its rich history of voodoo superstition and legends, it's not too surprising that some people would consider this. The most concrete suspect in this case was a man named Joseph Mumfree. Here's where things get interesting. After Mike Pepitone's murder, his widow Esther moved to Los Angeles and remarried. 2 years later, on the anniversary of her first husband's death, her new husband mysteriously vanished. Then, in December 1921, Mumfree came to her home, demanding money and threatening her. Esther shot him dead in self-defense, claiming that she recognized him as the man she'd seen fleeing her bedroom after her first husband's murder. As it turns out, Mumfree had a history of crime. He'd been involved in a blackmailing gang that preyed on Italians, and most of the Axeman's victims were Italian-American. Plus, police records showed that Mumfree had been in and out of prison for years, with his periods of freedom aligning suspiciously with the Axeman's attacks. It's compelling, but it's also worth noting that Esther initially described seeing 2 men flee the scene when her husband was killed, which raises questions about whether Mumfree acted alone or if there were other accomplices. When you think about it, the Axeman's story reads like a strange blend of urban legend and true crime. There's this mystery about his identity, the brutality of his attacks, and the odd details that just don't add up. Did he enjoy the fear he inspired, or was he driven by some personal vendetta? And why the strange jazz ultimatum? Was he genuinely obsessed with jazz, or was he just playing with the city's mind? To this day, no one knows for sure who the Axeman was. The case remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American crime history, and for good reason. The Axeman was like a living nightmare, and he left New Orleans scarred with questions that will probably never have answers. Theories may come and go, but the fact is, the Axeman did something that few killers manage. He captured the imagination of a city, blending horror with an almost mythical quality. Maybe that's what makes the Axeman so unsettling. He's not just a murderer who slipped through the cracks. He became a story, a boogeyman who lingers in New Orleans' dark history, as elusive and haunting as he was in life. Okay, so for our last unsolved mystery, we have to talk about one of the most mysterious, unsettling, and downright puzzling events of the 20th century, the Dyatlov Pass incident. This story has it all: a remote mountain, a group of experienced hikers, and an eerie, inexplicable tragedy that has left people scratching their heads for decades. What happened to these hikers in the Ural Mountains in early February 1959? Well, let's take it from the beginning, because the details are as baffling as they are tragic. In January 1959, 10 young hikers, mostly students and recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, set out on what was supposed to be an exciting winter trek across the Ural Mountains, with Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student, leading the way. These were no casual hikers. They were skilled, trained for this kind of rugged adventure. They planned to reach a mountain called Authoritative, which was about 10 kilometers north of where they ended up. But, as we know, they never made it. One of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, started feeling unwell shortly after the trip began and decided to turn back. As it turned out, he was the only one who would survive. The others, all 9 of them, would meet their fate on the slopes of a mountain ominously named Kholat Syakhl, which means Dead Mountain, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were setting up camp on a mountain with a name like that, I'd probably be a little uneasy. And considering what happened, maybe that eerie name was a sign of things to come. So, February 1st rolls around, and this is the last day anyone knows what the hikers were up to. Based on their diaries and cameras recovered later, it seems they set up camp on an exposed slope of Dead Mountain. Not exactly an ideal place to stop. The weather was brutal, visibility was low, and temperatures were around minus 30 degrees Celsius. It's speculated that they might have stopped there because they'd lost their bearings, or maybe they wanted to challenge themselves by camping out in such a harsh spot. Whatever the reason, that decision would end up hauntingly significant. Days passed, and when the group didn't return by their expected date, their families grew worried. Soon, a search party was launched, but it would be weeks before rescuers would make a grim discovery at their campsite. And what they found was disturbing, to say the least. When searchers finally stumbled upon the camp, they were immediately struck by something strange. The hiker's tent had been slashed open from the inside. It was as if something had terrified them so much that they didn't even bother unzipping or opening it properly. They just hacked their way out, desperate to escape. Footprints showed that the hikers fled into the bitter cold, many of them without shoes or even proper winter clothing. Imagine it. Skilled hikers, in sub-zero temperatures, running through the snow half-dressed, barefoot, and with no sense of direction. It's terrifying to think about. Over the next several weeks, searchers would find the bodies of all 9 hikers, scattered across different spots around the campsite. Each body revealed a new piece of the mystery and a lot of disturbing questions. Let's start with Igor Dyatlov, the group's leader. He was found lying on his back in the snow, gripping a small branch. His injuries were mostly minor, just some bruises and abrasions, and his official cause of death was hypothermia. But why was he holding that branch? Was he trying to defend himself or climb something? It's unclear, but his body told only a fraction of the strange story. Then there was Yuri Doroshenko, found not far from Dyatlov, near a large cedar tree. He was partially undressed, shoeless, and had burn marks on his hands. It looked like he'd tried to build a fire, maybe as a last attempt to stay alive. But he also had bruises and injuries that suggested he'd been in some kind of struggle. Even stranger, a piece of his hand appeared to have been bitten off. Did he do it to stay awake or conscious, or was it out of sheer pain or cold? We just don't know. Then things get even more unsettling with the discovery of Ludmila Dubinina. Her body was found further down in a ravine, and her injuries were far more severe. She had multiple broken ribs, her chest was caved in, and, the most gruesome part, she was missing her tongue and some of her facial tissue. Medical examiners couldn't make sense of it. The official report listed her cause of death as chest trauma from a powerful force. But what could have done that? And what happened to her tongue? There are theories, but none of them feel quite satisfying. Another hiker, Yuri Krivonishenko, was found close to Doroshenko, also near the cedar tree. He too had burns on his legs and hands, and here's where things take another strange twist. His clothing tested positive for radiation. Yes, radioactivity. Imagine the shock that must have caused in 1959, in the thick of the Cold War. The radioactive clothes raised all kinds of red flags, and to this day people wonder what the heck that was all about. Other members of the group were found with similar, inexplicable injuries. Alexander Kolovatov had head and neck injuries, including a deep wound on the side of his head. Rustem Slobodin had a fractured skull from what seemed to be a heavy blow, though hypothermia was listed as his cause of death. And then there was Nikolai Shibot-Brignol, whose injuries were so severe they were likened to a car crash. His skull had been crushed in a way that made no sense given where and how he was found. Finally, the oldest of the group, Semyon Zolotaryov, was found alongside Dubinina in the ravine. He had multiple broken ribs and no external injuries to indicate how they were broken. It was as if he'd been hit by an invisible force. When you add up these injuries, it doesn't make sense. Some of them had internal injuries, as if they'd been hit by an incredible force, while others had burns or radiation on their clothes. It was a nightmare scenario, and no one had any answers. Unsurprisingly, the mysterious nature of the incident led to countless theories. At the time, Soviet authorities put out a statement blaming an undefined, compelling natural force. Not exactly specific, right? This vague explanation left everyone wondering, and people started coming up with their own ideas to explain what had really happened on Dead Mountain. Theory 1. An avalanche? One of the more rational theories is that an avalanche caused the hikers to flee. The thinking goes that they heard the rumble of snow coming down and bolted from their tents in a panic. But here's the catch. There was no clear sign of an avalanche. No compacted snow, no path of debris, nothing that would usually be left behind by an avalanche. Plus, the injuries, especially the brutal internal traumas, don't really fit what you'd expect from a typical avalanche incident. 2. Military testing gone wrong. Given the radioactive traces on some of the clothes, another popular theory is that the hikers might have accidentally wandered into a Soviet military testing zone. There were rumors that the military was testing secret weapons in remote areas, and maybe these hikers were caught in the crossfire of some kind of experiment gone wrong. It's a compelling theory, but it doesn't explain all the injuries or the missing tongue. Hash Theory 3. Infrasound-induced panic. Now here's a strange one. The idea that infrasound waves, low-frequency sounds that can cause feelings of panic, nausea, and discomfort, might have triggered the hikers to flee. Some scientists believe that certain natural conditions, like high winds around mountains, can produce these infrasound waves. The hikers might have felt an uncontrollable sense of dread or disorientation, causing them to panic and run into the cold. This could explain the bizarre behavior, but again, it doesn't account for the serious injuries. Theory 4. A supernatural or extraterrestrial encounter? Then, of course, we have the more out there theories. Some people believe the hikers encountered something otherworldly, whether a supernatural force, a creature, or even extraterrestrials. The combination of strange injuries, radioactive traces, and the sheer mystery surrounding the incident has fueled speculation that the group might have crossed paths with something beyond human understanding. It's certainly a wild theory, but one that can't be completely dismissed, given the bizarre evidence. Theory 5. Joseph Stalin's secret snowman. And just when you think it can't get stranger, there's even a theory suggesting that the hikers encountered something the Soviets called Stalin's snowmen, creatures supposedly created through secret genetic experiments. The idea sounds like something out of a horror movie, but people bring it up because of the strange injuries and the sheer terror that must have driven them from their tent. The Soviet government's handling of the incident only added to the mystery. Authorities quickly shut down the investigation, sealing files and leaving the public with more questions than answers. For years, the details of the case were hidden away, and it wasn't until recent decades that some documents were declassified. Even so, many people believe that we still don't know everything. That perhaps there's more lurking in those mountains than we're ever going to be told. The case was reopened in 2019, and in 2020, Russian officials declared that an avalanche was the most likely cause. But this conclusion didn't sit well with a lot of people. After all, how does an avalanche explain missing tongues, radiation, and the kind of forceful injuries more like those from a car crash than a snowslide? To this day, the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the world's most haunting and perplexing unsolved mysteries. How did a group of experienced hikers end up dead in such strange circumstances? Each theory raises as many questions as it answers, and as much as we try to piece together what happened on Dead Mountain, something about it just defies logic. Maybe it was a tragic accident, or maybe they encountered something that no one can explain. Whatever it was, the memory of those 9 hikers endures, frozen in time, a chilling reminder of the unknown and the terror it can bring. And this concludes our Unsolved Mysteries for today. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. Would love to hear from you and your theories. If you like the stories, please don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button, the more the merrier. But to really help push these videos out, I would love you to hit the like button. That helps me out a lot. Good night, and until next time, sleep tight. On the evening of April 11, 1981, the Sharp family and some friends settled in for what they thought would be an ordinary night in cabin 28 of the Ketty Resort Lodge, nestled in the serene Sierra Nevada mountains of California. By morning, the quiet town of Ketty would awaken to a nightmare, a brutal massacre that would leave 4 people dead, shake the small community to its core, and spark one of the most haunting, unsolved murder cases in U.S. history. Over 40 years later, the mystery of what happened that night remains unsolved. But new developments have shed light on chilling details, reviving hope that justice may still be served. The following morning, Sheila Sharp, then 14 years old, returned to cabin 28 after spending the night at a friend's house nearby. She stepped into the cabin and was immediately confronted with a scene of unimaginable horror. Her mother, 36-year-old Sue Sharp, her brother, 15-year-old Johnny Sharp, and his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate were dead, brutally murdered in what could only be described as an act of pure savagery. The victims had been tied with electrical cords, their bodies bearing signs of extreme violence. Blood spattered the walls and ceilings, and the weapons used in the attack, a bloodied butcher knife, a bent steak knife, and a claw hammer, were found scattered in the living area. The sheer brutality of the crime stunned even seasoned investigators. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was missing. Her absence added a chilling layer of mystery to an already horrific scene. Strangely, Sheila's younger brothers, 10-year-old Rick and 5-year-old Greg, were found unharmed in a nearby bedroom alongside their friend Justin Smart, the son of a neighbor. None of the boys reported hearing anything unusual during the night. How they were spared from the violence remains a perplexing question. Sue Sharp had moved her 5 children to Keddie just a year prior, seeking a fresh start after leaving an abusive marriage. Described as a quiet, resilient woman, Sue worked hard to provide for her family despite their modest means. The family's life in Keddie was far from easy, but Sue was determined to build a stable home for her kids. In the aftermath of the murders, the search for Tina became a top priority. Tragically, her remains would not be discovered until 3 years later, when an anonymous tip led police to a desolate area in another county, nearly 50 miles away. Investigators recovered a portion of Tina's skull, confirming the worst fears of the Sharp family and the small Keddie community. From the beginning, the investigation into the Keddie cabin murders was riddled with problems. Early on, police focused their attention on 2 suspects, Marty Smart, a neighbor who lived just 2 cabins away, and his roommate, Bo Bubede, an ex-con with a murky past. Marty was an abusive husband, and rumors circulated that Sue Sharp had been counseling his wife Marilyn to leave him. Some believe Marty saw Sue's involvement as an unforgivable intrusion into his marriage and erupted in rage. Shortly after the murders, Marty moved to Reno, Nevada, raising further suspicions. Bo, meanwhile, had a criminal history and was reportedly close to Marty. Given the brutality of the crime, authorities believed it was likely the work of more than one person, which placed Bo under suspicion as a potential accomplice. Despite these leads, the investigation stalled. Critical evidence was mishandled or overlooked, and questions were raised about possible corruption within the Plumas County Sheriff's Office. Some community members even speculated that Sheriff Doug Thomas, who oversaw the case, had ties to Marty Smart, a claim Thomas vehemently denied. Nevertheless, the lack of progress fueled conspiracy theories and deepened frustration among the victims' families. In 2013, the case was reopened by Sheriff Greg Hagwood and investigator Mike Gamberg, both of whom had personal ties to the victims. Determined to right the wrongs of the original investigation, they uncovered a series of shocking revelations that shed new light on the murders. Gamberg discovered a letter written by Marty Smart to his wife shortly after the murders. In it, Marty chillingly wrote, "I've paid the price for your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through." Marilyn Smart confirmed the handwriting was Marty's, but claimed she didn't remember receiving the letter. The anonymous call. Gamberg also uncovered a recording of an anonymous 911 call that had tipped off police to the location of Tina's remains. Astonishingly, the recording had never been analyzed, nor had it been used in the original investigation. Investigators are now comparing the voice on the tape to audio samples from potential suspects in an attempt to find a match. The therapist's revelation. A former therapist of Marty Smart in Reno revealed to investigators that Marty had confessed to the murders during a session. The therapist expressed shock that the confession had not been acted upon by authorities at the time. The discovery of the hammer. A blue-handled claw hammer, matching the description of one Marty claimed to have lost, was found in a pond near Ketty. The hammer, believed to be a potential murder weapon, was sent for testing to determine whether it contained DNA or blood residue. Sheriff Hagwood believes several individuals in the community have knowledge of the crime, but have remained silent. There are people locally who know more than they've said, he remarked, adding that he and Gamberg have identified at least 6 people of interest who are still alive. As for the theory that Marty Smart and Bo Bubeg were the killers, Hagwood said, "It's a theory that we are working to the degree possible to conclude or dismiss. There's a disproportionate amount of evidence and information that tends to point in that direction." Sheila Sharp, who lost her mother, siblings, and a family friend that fateful night, has been outspoken about her belief that Marty Smart and Bo Bubeg were responsible. She expressed gratitude for Hagwood and Gamberg's efforts, stating, "Finally, I have somebody who cares. In the last 3 years, he's done more than the Plumas County Sheriff's Office has done in the previous 32 years. For the surviving members of the Sharp family, the reopening of the case offers a glimmer of hope that justice may one day be served." The Ketty Cabin murders remain one of the most brutal and baffling crimes in American history. Over 4 decades later, the question of who committed these horrific acts and why still lingers. But with renewed dedication and modern investigative tools, there is hope that the truth will finally emerge. As Sheriff Hagwood put it, there is not an expiration date on homicides, and to the extent that we have surviving siblings and family members, it is our fundamental obligation to them to understand who did this and why. One day, we may finally know what happened that night in Cabin 28. Until then, the haunting mystery of the Ketty murders continues to cast a long shadow over the quiet town. All right, quick little break here. If you're enjoying this story so far, go ahead and tap that like button. It really helps push this video out to more people who love true crime as much as you do. And hey, if you're not already subscribed, why not join us for more stories like this? All right, back to the mystery. Let's dive in. On February 22, 1946, Jimmy Hollis, 25, and Mary Jean Larry, 19, were returning from a date in the border town of Texarkana, straddling Texas and Arkansas. They stopped their car on a secluded, unpaved road about 100 yards from a neighborhood. After 10 minutes, a man approached their car. Mary Jean would later describe him. He wore a white mask over his head with cutouts for his eyes and mouth. He pointed a flashlight and a pistol at us and told Jimmy, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say." Both exited the car as ordered. The assailant demanded Jimmy remove his pants, then struck him twice on the head, fracturing his skull and knocking him unconscious. The attacker then attempted to rob and assault Mary Jean, though she pleaded they had no money. He struck her, knocking her down, and ordered her to run. When she did, he caught up to her, struck her again, and continued his assault. Jimmy eventually regained consciousness and flagged down a passing car, likely scaring off the assailant. Both Jimmy and Mary Jean survived, but Jimmy remained in the hospital for over 12 days. Just a month later, on March 24th, 29-year-old Richard L. Griffin and 17-year-old Polly Ann Moore were found dead in a parked 1941 Oldsmobile on a lover's lane nearby. Both had been shot in the head with what police suspected was a .32 caliber Colt pistol. Richard was found between the front seats with his pants pockets turned out, suggesting robbery, while Polly was in the back seat. Authorities believed she had been killed outside the car and placed inside later. Any footprints were washed away by rain, and despite interviewing over 50 people and following 100 false leads, police struggled to make progress. This double homicide alarmed the community, but didn't yet spark widespread fear, until 3 weeks later when another tragedy struck. On April 14th, authorities found the bodies of 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker and 16-year-old Paul Martin. The two teens had attended a dance the night before, with Betty Jo playing alto saxophone in a band at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Club. They left together around 1:30 a.m. Paul was found shot 4 times along a rural road, and Betty Jo's body was discovered a mile away in the woods. She had been raped and shot twice. Both had been killed with the same .32 caliber Colt, linking this attack to the previous one. Now, with 4 young people dead in less than 2 months, the community was in a panic. Women and children moved into the aptly named Hotel Grimm in downtown Texarkana when husbands and fathers were away. People armed themselves, and homemade security systems were rigged up with kitchenware and wire. Streets emptied, and the Texarkana Gazette dubbed the attacker the Phantom Killer. Investigator Tillman Johnson recalled, "We were constantly getting calls, mostly at night, about prowlers. People would call about any noise they heard at all. The fear that any resident could be the Phantom's next victim was pervasive." On May 3rd, 37-year-old farmer Virgil Starks was listening to the radio when a bullet from a .22 caliber gun tore through his porch window, fatally wounding him. His wife Katie rushed to his side, only to be shot twice in the face. Though badly injured, Katie managed to escape through the front door to a neighbor's house, leaving a trail of blood as she fled. She survived. Virgil, however, did not. This time, the police response was massive, with 20 to 30 officers converging on the Starks' home. Tillman Johnson remembered, "People would stand out near the front of their homes and yell at you to identify yourself before you got too close. You had to identify yourself, or you would get shot." Bloody footprints led across the highway before the trail went cold. Despite some differences between this and earlier attacks, such as the Starks' age, the setting in a home, and the use of a .22 caliber, the case was included in the Phantom investigation as panic escalated. Police tried dressing as young couples to lure the killer out, but the Phantom attacks stopped. 2 months later, the community began to feel safe enough to return to normal life, though no one was ever apprehended. Several theories about the Phantom killer's identity emerged, but 2 suspects stand out. H.B. Duty Tennyson, a college student, left behind a suicide note confessing to the murders. In it, he allegedly wrote, "Why did I take my own life? Well, when you committed 2 double murders, you would too. Yes, I did kill Betty Jo Booker and Paul Martin in the city park that night, and killed Mr. Stark and tried to get Mrs. Stark." Duty's cousin, forensic psychiatrist Dr. John Tennyson, later suggested that Duty had connections to the victims. He had been an usher at a theater some victims had attended before their deaths, attended high school with Betty Jo, and was acquainted with a family member of Katie Starks. Another suspect, 29-year-old Ewell Lee Swinney, caught police attention when Arkansas State Trooper Max Tackett noticed a pattern. Stolen cars often appeared abandoned near crime scenes. When Tackett found another abandoned car in a downtown parking lot on June 28, 1946, it led him to Swinney's 21-year-old wife, Peggy, who ultimately implicated her husband. In detailed but varying statements, Peggy described how Ewell had committed the murders, recalling that on April 13, the day before Paul and Betty Jo's bodies were found, he left her in their car, saying he had to take a leak, and returned an hour later with his clothes wet up to the waist. She also mentioned that Paul's date book had been thrown in some bushes, a fact only the sheriff knew, as he had personally discovered the book. Despite Peggy's admissions, her testimony was legally protected as she and Ewell had married hours before their arrest. Investigators subjected Ewell to a truth serum in Little Rock, but he passed out due to an overdose of the drug. "I think if we'd kept him here in Texarkana and kept questioning him, we would have eventually gotten the truth," Johnson lamented. Though Peggy was jailed briefly for her role in car theft, she was eventually released. Ewell was sentenced to life in prison on a habitual criminal charge, but he was paroled in 1973. He died in 1994 without ever being charged for the murders. The Texarkana Phantom murders left a lasting scar on a once unfazed community. As local resident W.E. Atchison, who was 16 at the time, recalled, "The big wonder for everyone back then was whether the killings were being done by someone who lived among us, and I still wonder who did it." Across 4 attacks, 5 people were killed and 3 others severely injured, yet the identity of the phantom killer remains unsolved. Athalia Ponsell Lindsley led a life that could have been pulled straight from a novel. Born into privilege, she didn't just settle into a quiet life. She stood out. She graced Broadway as an actress, turned heads as a model, invented gadgets, worked as a real estate agent, and even wrote a book. But beneath the glamour and ambition was a polarizing figure. The Orlando Sentinel once described her as sharp-tongued and aggressive, someone who would not have won any popularity contests. Her drive extended to politics, but in 1970, her run for the Florida legislature ended in failure. By 1973, Athalia had turned a new chapter, marrying James Lindsley, a real estate agent and former mayor of St. Augustine, Florida. It might have seemed like a happy ending, but just months into their marriage, cracks were already forming. By January 1974, the couple still lived in separate homes, with Athalia staying in her own house as she prepared to move in with James. Tragically, she would never get the chance. On January 23, 1974, just after 6 p.m., Athalia stepped onto her porch with Clementine, her pet blue jay. It was a routine moment that turned horrifying in an instant. Out of nowhere, a man approached with a machete and attacked her with such ferocity that by the time police arrived, she was nearly decapitated. "She was dead when we got there," Police Chief Virgil Stewart later said. "She had been badly butchered. Her head was almost cut off." The brutality of the attack sent shockwaves through the peaceful, historic streets of St. Augustine. And Clementine? The little blue jay vanished that night, adding an eerie touch to an already haunting crime. A neighbor, 19-year-old Locke McCormick, heard Athalia's screams and rushed over, only to find her lifeless body on the porch. Locke told police he saw a man, somewhere between 40 and 60 years old, walking away. The man wore a white shirt and dark pants, but Locke couldn't see his face. Another witness reported spotting a trail of blood leading around the south side of Athalia's home. In a baffling move, a police officer ordered ambulance attendants to hose down the blood, destroying potential evidence. Investigators scrambled to piece together what had happened. A $500 reward was offered for any information, a modest sum that reflected the urgency but also the limitations of the small-town police force. Then, on February 17th, a break in the case came, or so it seemed. A county mechanic named Dewey Lee discovered a machete, a bloodied white shirt, dark pants, a watch, and shoes in the marshes just a mile from Athalia's home. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. As the investigation into Athalia's murder stalled, another chilling event shook the community. Francis Bamus, a 70-year-old retired public relations executive and fashion consultant, was reportedly working on a book about Athalia's murder. Francis had told friends she believed she knew something about the crime, but seemed unconcerned about her own safety. In fact, she publicly declared St. Augustine to be the safest place I have ever lived. She continued her nightly walks until November 3, 1974. That evening, Francis was brutally murdered. Her body was found in a vacant lot not far from Athalia's home. She had been bludgeoned with a stone block, her body partially burned, and her clothes torn, though no evidence of sexual assault was found. Despite the proximity in time and location, Police Chief Virgil Stewart insisted there was no connection between the murders. But to many, the two brutal deaths seemed too close for coincidence. The search for Athalia's killer centered on two primary suspects: her estranged husband, James Lindsley, and her neighbor, Alan Stanford. Theory 1. James Lindsley presented himself as an easygoing real estate agent and former mayor, but Athalia's letters to her sister told a very different story. In one letter, she described James as a complete leech, a complete liar, and noted that she had changed the locks on her home. Adding fuel to the fire, there were rumors that the crime scene had been cleaned up to protect James. At trial, James admitted he owned a machete similar to the murder weapon, which he kept in his car for clearing brush. After Athalia's death, he turned the machete over to police, but claimed he couldn't be sure if it was the one used in the crime, saying, "All machetes look alike to me." James's alibi on the day of the murder also raised eyebrows. According to author Elizabeth Randall, there was a 15 to 25-minute gap in his timeline, enough time for him to drive to Athalia's house and commit the crime. Theory 2. The neighbor. Athalia's relationship with her neighbor, Alan Stanford, was anything but friendly. Known for her love of animals, Athalia kept noisy pets, including dogs and, at one point, a goat. This didn't sit well with her neighbors, who filed noise complaints. Athalia retaliated by cutting branches from Stanford's trees that hung over her property line and planting bamboo near his driveway. The feud escalated when Athalia publicly accused Stanford, who was a county manager, of neglecting his duties and even sabotaging her car by putting sugar in the gas tank. On October 9, 1974, just months before her murder, Athalia reported to officials that Stanford had threatened her life, saying, "I'll kill you." On the day of the murder, investigators noted a blood trail leading from Athalia's driveway to a concrete wall separating her property from Stanford's. Locke McCormick initially reported seeing Mr. Stanford hitting Miss Ponsell, though he later clarified he hadn't seen the man's face. Then there was the evidence found in the marshes. Among the items was a watch identified as Stanford's. While Stanford claimed his watch had gone missing and a jeweler confirmed it was his, the evidence wasn't enough to convict. Stanford's church and friends raised $250,000, over $1.3 million today, for his defense, suggesting the community's divided loyalties. Defense attorneys argued that Dewey Lee, the mechanic who found the evidence, had planted it. They even brought forward a witness who claimed to have seen Dewey in Athalia's yard 2 hours before the murder. Ultimately, the jury deliberated for just 2.5 hours before acquitting Stanford. In less than a year, 2 brutal murders rocked St. Augustine, leaving a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. Was Athalia killed by a vengeful husband, a feuding neighbor, or someone else entirely? And was Frances Bemis's death truly unrelated, or was she silenced for knowing too much? To this day, the case remains unsolved, its secrets buried along with its victims. What we do know is that Athalia Lindsley's life, marked by ambition and defiance, ended in a horrifying act of violence that continues to haunt the quiet streets of St. Augustine. Let's set the scene. It's the 1930s, and Cleveland, Ohio, is in the grip of the Great Depression. The city is struggling, people are out of work, shanty towns are popping up everywhere, and hope is hard to come by. In a place called Kingsbury Run, a ravine near downtown, the city's most desperate residents, transients, the homeless, and people just scraping by, are trying to survive in makeshift camps. Now imagine this. In the midst of all this hardship, a killer emerges. A killer unlike anything the city has ever seen. People start turning up dead, dismembered, decapitated, and left in horrifying displays. The police don't know who's doing it, but one thing is clear. Cleveland has a serial killer on its hands. They call him the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, and his crimes are so brutal that they still haunt the city today. The story begins in 1934, when a woman's mutilated body is found on the shores of Lake Erie near Euclid Beach. She becomes known as the Lady of the Lake. Her lower torso is discovered first, but her limbs and head are missing. What's even stranger? Her skin has been treated with some kind of chemical, leaving it reddish and leathery. At first, police think this is just a one-off crime, but later, they realize she's the first victim of a far more terrifying killer. Fast forward to September 1935, when another body is discovered near a place ominously called Jackass Hill in Kingsbury Run. This victim is a young man, dubbed John Doe 1. His head and genitals have been removed, and just like the Lady of the Lake, his skin shows that same eerie chemical treatment. At this point, police start putting the pieces together. Cleveland has a serial killer, and he's targeting the city's most vulnerable people. The killer's signature. What sets this killer apart is his horrifying precision. Let's break it down. Decapitation. Most of the victims are beheaded, and the heads are rarely found. This makes identification nearly impossible. Can you imagine the kind of cold calculation it takes to do that? Not once, but over and over again. 2. Dismemberment. The bodies are often cut into pieces, with limbs and torsos left in different locations. It's like the killer wants to make sure these victims are never whole again. 3. Chemical treatment. Some of the bodies show signs of exposure to chemicals, possibly to preserve them or destroy evidence. Whatever the reason, it's chilling. And number 4. Victim profile. Most of the victims are transients or people living on the fringes of society. Sex workers, the homeless, and day laborers. They're people who are often overlooked, which may be exactly why the killer chooses them. Over the next few years, the murders continue. The bodies keep piling up, each one more shocking than the last. Let's talk about some of the most infamous cases. Florence Polillo, January 1936. Florence is one of the few victims identified. She's a sex worker and barmaid, and her dismembered body is found wrapped in butcher paper and dumped across multiple locations in downtown Cleveland. Her murder confirms what everyone's starting to fear. The killer is targeting society's most vulnerable. John Doe 2. This time, 2 headless bodies are found together near Kingsbury Run. 2 victims placed side by side as if the killer is putting on a gruesome display. It's a twisted form of taunting, a reminder that he's still out there. Jane Doe, February 1937. Under a bridge, a headless woman's body is discovered. The same signs of dismemberment and chemical treatment are there, but her identity, like so many others, remains a mystery. The final known victims, August 1938. The last 2 bodies are found within sight of Elliot Ness's office. Yes, that Elliot Ness, the same man who brought down Al Capone. The killer is practically mocking him, leaving the victims' headless torsos in plain view. By now, Cleveland is in a full-blown panic. The gruesome nature of the murders has everyone terrified, and the police are under immense pressure to solve the case. That's when Elliot Ness steps in. As Cleveland's public safety director, Ness is determined to stop the killer. But this isn't Chicago, and Ness isn't dealing with gangsters anymore. This is something darker, something far more sinister. Ness takes bold action. In 1938, he ordered a massive raid on Kingsbury Run, where many of the city's homeless live. The shanty towns are burned to the ground in hopes of flushing out the killer or scaring him into stopping. But it doesn't work. Instead, it leaves countless people displaced and terrified. Ness also leans on the emerging field of psychological profiling. Investigators speculate that the killer might be a doctor, a butcher, or someone with an unsettling knowledge of anatomy. The precise dismemberments suggest a level of skill that's hard to ignore. Over the years, 2 suspects have stood out. A bricklayer with ties to victim Florence Polillo. Dolezal is arrested in 1939 and confesses to the murders. But here's the thing. His confession doesn't hold up. He later recants, saying he was coerced, and before he can go to trial, he's found dead in his jail cell. His injuries suggest foul play, deepening the mystery. Was he the killer, or just a convenient scapegoat? Dr. Francis Sweeney, a much more compelling suspect. Dr. Sweeney was a surgeon and a World War I veteran with a history of erratic behavior, possibly linked to psychological trauma. Ness personally interrogated Sweeney, who failed multiple polygraph tests. But Sweeney had powerful political connections, and he was never formally charged. Instead, he spent much of his life in a veterans' hospital. Could this man, with his medical expertise and unstable mind, have been the Mad Butcher? The Cleveland torso murders left a scar on the city. By 1938, at least 12 victims were attributed to the Mad Butcher, but some believe the real number could be even higher. The case remains unsolved, and the killer's true identity is still a mystery. What makes this story so chilling isn't just the brutality of the murders, it's the fact that the killer seemed to vanish into thin air. Did he stop killing? Did he die? Or did he simply move on, continuing his reign of terror somewhere else? Even today, the Cleveland torso murders capture our darkest fears, that there are some crimes so twisted, so terrifying, that they may never be fully understood. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains one of America's most infamous unsolved mysteries, a haunting reminder of the horrors lurking in the shadows. On July 26, 1974, a young girl walking her dog in the dunes of Race Point Beach near Provincetown, Massachusetts, made a chilling discovery. She stumbled upon the partially decomposed body of a woman hidden in a patch of scrub brush. Lying on a green beach blanket, the body was found with both hands missing, severed at the wrists, and some teeth removed, likely an attempt to prevent identification. Police believed she had been dead for approximately 2 weeks before the discovery. The woman was estimated to be between 20 and 40 years old, with reddish-brown hair tied back in a ponytail. She was approximately 5'6" to 5'8" tall and weighed around 145 pounds. She was found wearing Wrangler jeans and a blue bandana, but no shirt, and there were no signs of sexual assault. The woman had sustained blunt force trauma to the head, which was determined to be the cause of death. Near the body, a set of footprints and tire tracks were discovered, but these clues ultimately led nowhere. The press dubbed the unidentified victim the Lady of the Dunes, and the mystery of her identity, as well as the circumstances of her murder, has haunted investigators and locals ever since. Early investigations focused on determining the identity of the Lady of the Dunes. Police checked missing persons databases, interviewed local residents, and examined the victim's dental work. Her teeth had been professionally maintained, indicating she likely had access to regular dental care, which was somewhat uncommon at the time. Without a name, the case stalled. Over the years, law enforcement agencies used various forensic techniques, hoping that advances in technology might provide new leads. Multiple attempts were made to reconstruct her face using forensic artistry and later, computer-generated reconstructions. For decades, her unidentified body was buried in Provincetown with a marker reading simply, "Unidentified female body found Race Point Dunes, July 26, 1974. Several theories and potential suspects have emerged over the years, but none have provided definitive answers. Mob connections. Some speculated that the Lady of the Dunes may have been a victim of mob activity. Her hands were removed, a detail often associated with gangland killings to prevent fingerprint identification. However, no connections to organized crime were ever substantiated. Serial killers. Tony Costa, a local carpenter and handyman, was convicted of killing several women in Provincetown in the 1960s. Known as the Cape Cod Vampire, Costa's brutality and location led some to believe he could have been involved. However, Costa had already died in prison by 1974. Another potential suspect was Haddon Clark, a confessed serial killer who claimed to have murdered the Lady of the Dunes. Clark had a history of mental illness, and while he provided some credible information, he also claimed to have killed numerous victims that were later disproved, making his confession unreliable. The Jaws connection. One of the most intriguing theories surfaced in 2015 when author Joe Hill, son of Stephen King, noticed a woman resembling the Lady of the Dunes among the extras in the 1975 blockbuster Jaws. Filming for Jaws took place in Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, not far from Provincetown. This woman was seen wearing similar clothes to those found with the Lady of the Dunes, sparking speculation that she might have been an extra in the film. While this theory added a fascinating angle to the case, no concrete evidence emerged linking the woman on screen to the Lady of the Dunes. Locals and possible personal connections. Given that Provincetown was a relatively small community, some speculated that the killer might have been someone familiar with the area. Despite interviews with many local residents, investigators were unable to uncover any personal connections between the victim and the community. Furthermore, with Provincetown's tourism and seasonal visitors, the Lady of the Dunes could have easily been an outsider. With the development of DNA technology, the case saw renewed interest. In 2000, her body was exhumed to collect DNA samples, which were then entered into various DNA databases in the hope of finding a match. Despite several cross-checks and searches, no relatives or leads surfaced. With the rise of genealogical databases and forensic genealogy gave a new dimension to cold case investigations. After the success of using genealogical techniques to solve the case of the Golden State Killer, the Provincetown Police and the FBI were hopeful they might find a similar breakthrough for the Lady of the Dunes. In 2019, they began using genealogical techniques in an attempt to identify the woman or her relatives, and in 2022, this effort finally led to a significant breakthrough. After nearly 50 years, in October 2022, the FBI confirmed that the Lady of the Dunes had been identified as Ruth Marie Terry, a 37-year-old woman from Tennessee. Investigators used advanced DNA testing and genealogical research to trace her identity, connecting her to living relatives who provided DNA samples that confirmed the match. This revelation provided the Lady of the Dunes with a name and some context, but the circumstances surrounding her death remain a mystery. Ruth Terry had been estranged from her family and was not reported missing, which complicated efforts to connect her to a specific time or place. Her family members told police they hadn't heard from her in years, but had no idea she was dead. With Ruth Terry's identity now confirmed, the investigation has shifted to uncovering who might have killed her and why. Law enforcement is reviewing her known relationships and attempting to trace her activities in the months leading up to her death. One potential lead is Guy Moldovan, a man she was reportedly married to around the time of her death. Moldovan was previously a suspect in the disappearance of his previous wife and stepdaughter in the 1960s, and some of his statements about Ruth's whereabouts were inconsistent. However, Moldovan passed away in 2002, making it challenging for authorities to pursue further leads directly involving him. Still, the FBI continues to investigate whether he or any other individuals were involved in her murder. The Lady of the Dunes case has become a prominent unsolved mystery, capturing the public's imagination and inspiring books, documentaries, and podcasts. For the community of Provincetown, Ruth Terry's story has been both haunting and fascinating, drawing visitors and amateur sleuths to Race Point Beach, hoping to uncover clues in the sands where her body was once found. Despite the identification, significant questions remain. The identity of Ruth Marie Terry finally brought some closure to the mystery, yet it left behind many unanswered questions. Investigators remain hopeful that advances in technology and public awareness could eventually solve the case fully, providing justice and answers to her remaining family and the Provincetown community. Let's go back to the late 16th century, when England was eager to expand its reach to the New World. It was an era of fierce competition and ambition, and England's Queen Elizabeth Thirst had granted a charter to Sir Walter Raleigh, one of her trusted explorers, to establish a colony in North America. England had its sights on building a permanent settlement, one that could serve as a gateway for trade and exploration. Perhaps even more appealing, it could be a strategic base for launching raids against the Spanish, England's main rival at the time. This colony would, they hoped, be the beginning of England's presence in the New World. The first attempt to establish this colony happened in 1585 when Raleigh sent an expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville to Roanoke Island, which is now part of North Carolina's Outer Banks. It was an ambitious effort, but the settlers soon realized the challenges they faced were far greater than anticipated. They struggled with food shortages, and most troubling of all, tensions with the indigenous Algonquian tribes. Early English explorers had strained relations with the tribes, and mistrust ran high. The Roanoke settlers were unprepared for the harsh living conditions, and after a while, they simply couldn't hold out any longer. Most of them returned to England when Sir Francis Drake passed by and offered them passage on his way back from the Caribbean. Despite the failure of this first attempt, Raleigh was determined. In 1587, he organized a second expedition. This time, it was led by John White, an artist and cartographer with first-hand experience from the previous expedition. But there was something different about this second colony. Raleigh sent not just men, but 115 colonists, including women and children, with the intention of establishing a permanent settlement. Among them were White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband, as well as Eleanor's soon-to-be-born daughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. In July 1587, the new group of colonists arrived on Roanoke Island. They were hopeful but quickly encountered familiar challenges. Relations with nearby tribes were tense. Some were wary and others openly hostile. Previous encounters had made the indigenous people justifiably suspicious of these newcomers, and the colonists found themselves isolated and vulnerable. To make matters worse, their supplies were running dangerously low. Desperate, John White decided he would return to England to gather the resources they needed to survive. He promised to return swiftly, within months, to bring back supplies and more settlers. Little did he know that fate had other plans. Unfortunately, White's timing couldn't have been worse. When he returned to England in 1588, the country was caught up in a fierce naval struggle with Spain. The Spanish Armada was gearing up to invade, and Queen Elizabeth ordered that every available English ship be used in defense. White couldn't secure a vessel to bring him back to Roanoke. As the conflict raged on, months turned into years, and it was 3 long years before White could return to the colony. He must have imagined the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found when he finally returned on August 18, 1590. When White landed on Roanoke Island, it was as if the settlers had simply vanished. He saw no trace of the 115 people he'd left behind, not his daughter, not his son-in-law, and not even his granddaughter, Virginia. The settlement itself was eerie. The buildings hadn't been destroyed, instead they'd been carefully dismantled, as if the colony had been methodically packed up and moved. It didn't look like the aftermath of an attack. It looked planned. The only clues left behind were 2 carvings. One word, Croatoan, carved into a fence post, and the letters Crow etched into a tree nearby. White had discussed with the colonists before he left that if they needed to relocate, they should leave a message. They even agreed that if they were in danger, they would carve a cross to signal distress. But there was no cross, just the single word, Croatoan. This word pointed to a nearby island, Croatoan, now called Hatteras Island, where a friendly tribe of the same name lived. It seemed to suggest that the colonists had left willingly. White was anxious to follow this lead, but a severe storm rolled in, forcing his ship to retreat. He never got a chance to search Croatoan Island for the colonists, and heartbreakingly, he returned to England without answers. The Roanoke colonists had disappeared, leaving behind only questions. For centuries, the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke has been one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Many theories have been proposed, but none have been definitively proven. Here are some of the most plausible explanations that historians and archaeologists have explored. Integration with the Croatoan tribe. The most widely accepted theory is that the colonists moved to Croatoan Island and were taken in by the Croatoan tribe. Later accounts from English settlers who explored the area around Jamestown mention sightings of indigenous people with European features, lighter skin, blue or gray eyes, that were unusual for native populations. Historians speculate that the Roanoke settlers may have assimilated into the tribe to survive. Relocation inland. Another theory suggests that the colonists moved inland in search of more fertile land and resources along the Chowan River. Archaeological digs at a site known as Site X, near Edenton, North Carolina, have uncovered English pottery and weaponry from the late 1500s. Some believe these artifacts could be evidence that at least some of the Roanoke settlers established a new community inland. Attack by Spanish forces. Since England and Spain were at war, some have speculated that Spanish forces from nearby Florida could have wiped out the colony. However, there are no Spanish records indicating an attack, and the fact that the buildings were carefully dismantled rather than destroyed suggests an organized move, not a violent raid. Death by starvation or disease. Living conditions on Roanoke Island were harsh, with limited food supplies and strained relations with neighboring tribes. Some historians suggest that starvation or disease may have decimated the colony. But this theory doesn't fully explain the total lack of remains or signs of bodies. Something would have been left behind. Dispersal of small groups. One theory proposes that the colonists, realizing they couldn't survive together, split into smaller groups, each going in different directions to improve their chances. Some might have joined local tribes, while others may have perished in the wilderness. This could explain why no single settlement or mass grave has ever been found. Efforts to uncover the truth behind the lost colony have continued for centuries. Modern archaeology and technology have given us new clues, though they still leave much to the imagination. The Croatoan Project. Archaeologists have conducted extensive digs on Hatteras Island, uncovering artifacts like writing slates, glass, and other items of English origin from the late 16th century. These finds suggest some level of contact between the Croatoan tribe and English settlers, lending credibility to the theory that the Roanoke colonists may have joined them. In 2012, researchers discovered another site called Site X in Bertie County, North Carolina. They found pottery and tools from the late 1500s, though no definitive evidence ties the site to the Roanoke settlers. Still, the discovery keeps the possibility alive that the colonists moved inland, away from Roanoke Island. The enduring legacy of the lost colony. The Roanoke colony's disappearance has become a legend in American history, a symbol of the unknown, and a reminder of the dangers and isolation faced by early settlers. Over the centuries, the tale of the lost colony has inspired countless books, movies, and theories, from realistic to the wildly speculative. And with each passing year, the story becomes more entrenched in American folklore. Even today, historians and archaeologists continue to search for answers. Advances in DNA analysis and ongoing archaeological efforts may eventually reveal what happened. But until then, the Roanoke colony remains one of history's most haunting mysteries, a story of hope, hardship, and disappearance without a trace. Will we ever know the fate of the lost colony? Only time, and perhaps a lucky discovery, will tell. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, a celebration of hard work, success, and the excitement of new beginnings. Natalie Holloway, an 18-year-old high school graduate from Mountain Brook, Alabama, was preparing to start her next chapter in life at the University of Alabama. But before diving into college, she embarked on a senior trip to the sunny paradise of Aruba, along with 124 classmates. This picturesque island, with its turquoise waters and bustling nightlife, was the perfect backdrop for young graduates looking to let loose after years of academic dedication. On May 30th, 2005, the group's trip took a dark turn. That was the night Natalie vanished without a trace. What began as a celebratory vacation turned into an international mystery that gripped headlines and broke hearts around the globe. Aruba is a small Caribbean island known for its pristine beaches, luxury resorts, and vibrant nightlife. It's also renowned for being a relatively safe tourist destination. Mountain Brook High School had been sending graduating seniors to Aruba for years without incident. But in 2005, the class of Natalie Holloway would forever change that perception. The group stayed at the Holiday Inn, spending their days enjoying the beach and their nights frequenting local hotspots like Carlos and Charlie's, a popular nightclub where tourists and locals alike mingled over music and cocktails. On May 29th, their last evening in Aruba, Natalie was seen dancing and drinking at Carlos and Charlie's. It was the last time her classmates would see her alive. Around closing time, Natalie left the club with 3 young men: Joran van der Sloot, a 17-year-old Dutch national, and 2 brothers, Deepak and Satish Kalpu. She willingly got into their car, reportedly saying she wanted to see the beach. According to witnesses, she was intoxicated, but she seemed to be enjoying herself. When Natalie didn't show up for her flight home the next morning, panic set in. Her packed bags, left untouched in her hotel room, suggested she had intended to return. Her disappearance launched a desperate search by her classmates, the Aruban authorities, and eventually the FBI. From the start, suspicion fell on Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers. Joran was a charismatic and handsome teenager who lived on the island with his family. A frequent visitor to the casinos and nightclubs, He was well known for his smooth-talking demeanor and penchant for preying on tourists. Initially, Joran claimed he and the brothers had dropped Natalie off at her hotel around 2 a.m. He later changed his story multiple times, creating a web of lies that only deepened the mystery. One version claimed Natalie fell ill on the beach and he left her there, assuming she'd find her way back. Another story, more sinister, suggested she was sold into human trafficking, a claim Joran later recanted. As the search for Natalie intensified, the case became a media sensation. Joran's inconsistent stories made him the prime suspect, but the lack of concrete evidence left authorities at a standstill. The Aruban police arrested Joran and the Kalpoe brothers multiple times, only to release them due to insufficient evidence. The American media, led by networks like Fox News and CNN, descended on Aruba, turning the case into a sensationalized soap opera. Joran, ever the manipulator, used the attention to his advantage. He gave interviews, each more bizarre than the last, spinning tales that kept him in the spotlight while providing no real answers. In 2008, Dutch reporter Patrick van der Eem befriended Joran, gaining his trust by posing as a drug dealer. Using hidden cameras, van der Eem recorded Joran's latest confession. He claimed Natalie had died accidentally on the beach, and her body was disposed of at sea by a friend named Dory. This confession seemed to offer the breakthrough investigators needed, until Joran retracted it, claiming he had been under the influence of marijuana and lied to impress van der Eem. Once again, the case hit a dead end. While Natalie's disappearance remained unsolved, Joran's violent tendencies came to light in 2010. In Peru, he was arrested for the brutal murder of Stephanie Flores, a 21-year-old woman he killed in a hotel room after she discovered information about Natalie's case on his laptop. Joran pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 28 years in prison. His arrest in Peru reignited interest in the Holloway case, but Joran continued to deny involvement. Despite his conviction for Stephanie's murder, no concrete evidence has ever linked him definitively to Natalie's disappearance. In 2012, Natalie Holloway was declared legally dead by an Alabama court. For her family, it was a heartbreaking acknowledgement of what they had feared all along. Natalie, the bright and ambitious young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, would never return. Her disappearance serves as a haunting reminder of how quickly joy can turn to tragedy. What was meant to be a celebration of Natalie's hard work and achievements became a nightmare that continues to resonate nearly 2 decades later. Aruba, once a paradise in the eyes of her classmates, became the backdrop for a mystery that remains unsolved. And Natalie Holloway, forever 18, remains in the hearts of those who loved her and the minds of those still seeking justice. Hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but if you enjoy these stories, it would help me out a lot. If you smash that like button, it helps to push these videos out. If you subscribe, that would be great. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and if there's any stories you would like me to cover. Right, back to the story. Every town has its secrets, its eerie mysteries that linger in hushed whispers long after the sun sets. But what if one of those secrets came with a warning, an unmistakable feeling of doom that wouldn't let you rest? Let's talk about premonitions. You know, those unsettling feelings that something bad is about to happen. Maybe it's the voice in your head telling you not to walk down a certain street, or a sudden gut instinct about a person you barely know. Premonitions go beyond intuition. They're vivid, unnerving, and almost impossible to ignore. For Cindy Anderson, her premonitions weren't just feelings. They were nightmares. The same horrific scenario played out in her dreams again and again, leaving her paralyzed with dread. In the nightmare, Cindy was at her desk at work, going about her usual duties as a legal secretary. There was a knock at the door. She got up to answer, only to find a man she recognized standing there. At first, everything seemed fine, until it wasn't. His demeanor turned sinister. He began tormenting her, chasing her through the office until he caught her, and then he killed her. Cindy's premonitions were so vivid they left her shaking in the mornings. Her sister remembers her crying in their mother's arms after one particularly bad dream, screaming, "He murdered me, Mom!" This wasn't the reaction of a child scared of the dark. Cindy was a grown woman, 20 years old, and typically calm and composed. But these nightmares rattled her to her core. The Anderson family, devout Christians in Toledo, Ohio, didn't know what to make of it. Sure, Cindy's nightmares were unsettling, but what could they do? They were just dreams, or so they thought. Despite the darkness that plagued her nights, Cindy's life was in a good place. She was saving up money while living at home, preparing to attend Bible college with her boyfriend. She worked as a legal secretary at a small law firm, a job she enjoyed, at least at first. About 10 months before Cindy's disappearance, something strange happened. One morning, as she sat down at her desk, she glanced out the window at the building next door. Spray painted on the wall, in large bold letters, were the words, "I love you, Cindy, by G.W." Now, some people might have found this flattering, but Cindy wasn't one of them. She didn't know anyone with the initials G.W., and the message felt invasive, almost stalker-like. Her co-workers didn't know anyone by those initials either. For 6 months, that graffiti stared back at her every day. The property owner eventually removed it, and for a while, life returned to normal. But then, it happened again. The same message appeared on the wall, bigger this time, more brazen. Whoever GW was, he wasn't going to be ignored. And then the phone calls started. Almost every day, Cindy answered the phone at work to hear a strange man on the other end. He never introduced himself and would say disturbing things. What, exactly, has never been disclosed. Cindy started hanging up as soon as she realized it was him, but the calls kept coming, sometimes multiple times a day. Her co-workers were so concerned that they started keeping the office door locked at all times. An emergency buzzer was even installed at Cindy's desk, just in case. On August 3rd, 1981, the day before Cindy disappeared, a client named Larry Mullins came into the office. While he was filling out paperwork, the phone rang. Cindy answered it, immediately hung up, and looked visibly shaken. When the phone rang again moments later, she repeated the process. Larry asked her if she was okay, and Cindy brushed it off, saying, "It's just some weirdo who keeps calling." But Larry wasn't convinced. She looked terrified. So much so that he called the police when he got home, urging them to check on her. Unfortunately, they never got the chance. The next morning, August 4th, Cindy arrived at work around 8:30 a.m., as usual. Witnesses saw her at 9:45 a.m., but after that, nothing. When her bosses arrived around noon, Cindy was gone. The lights were still on, and the door was locked from the inside. Her car was in the parking lot, locked as well. Strangely, there was a faint smell of nail polish remover in the office, but no bottle or explanation for it. Cindy's purse and keys were missing, but she hadn't left a note saying where she was, which she always did if she stepped out. Even more unsettling was the book she'd been reading, left open on her desk. It was a dramatic romance novel, and the page it was open to described a woman being abducted at knife point. The police were called, but there were no signs of a struggle. Cindy had vanished. As with any unsolved case, theories abound. 1 month after Cindy disappeared, an anonymous woman called the police. Whispering, she claimed that Cindy was being held captive in the basement of a White House. She said the house was one of 2, side by side, owned by the same family. The parents were out of town, and their son was holding Cindy against her will. The caller refused to give her name or an address and hung up. When she called back later, a detective tried to listen in on another line, but she realized it and hung up again. She never called back. Police searched for White Houses that matched the description, but found nothing. Then there's the graffiti. A janitor with the initials GW who worked at the strip mall was questioned, but cleared of any involvement. Later, another man came forward claiming responsibility for the graffiti, saying it was meant for a different Cindy entirely. His story checked out, and he too was cleared. There's also speculation that Cindy ran away to escape the strict confines of her religious upbringing, but her family and boyfriend strongly refute this, pointing out that she left behind her car, her money, and her social security number, which has never been used since. And then there's the most chilling theory of all. Cindy may have been a victim of something far darker. In 1995, nearly 14 years after Cindy disappeared, her former employer, Richard Neller, was indicted for his involvement in a drug trafficking ring. During the trial, a witness testified that the ring's leader, Jose Rodriguez Jr., had confessed to killing Cindy. Rodriguez allegedly believed she had overheard sensitive conversations about their illegal activities and murdered her to send a message to Neller. But this confession was never substantiated, and Cindy's case remains unsolved. Perhaps Cindy's nightmares were just that, nightmares. Or perhaps they were something more. Maybe on the day she disappeared, her worst fear came true. She heard a knock at the door, recognized the man standing there, and let him in. What happened after that is anyone's guess. Cindy Anderson's story is a haunting reminder that sometimes our instincts and dreams might be trying to tell us something. If you ever find yourself experiencing a premonition or a recurring dream that feels too real, don't ignore it. It just might save your life. Picture this. A quiet family vanishes without a trace, only to be discovered years later as skeletal remains. Their mysterious deaths have sparked countless theories, ranging from cult rituals to supernatural forces, and even connections to criminal organizations. But what's the real story? Buckle up, because today we're diving into the chilling and perplexing case of the Jameson family. Bobby Dale Jameson, 44, his wife Sherilyn, 40, and their 6-year-old daughter, Madison Stormy Star Jameson, disappeared on October 8, 2009, in the rugged Sands Boy Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma. Before their fateful trip, the family had been living in Eufaula, Oklahoma, leading what many described as an isolated, almost reclusive lifestyle. Bobby, a self-employed businessman, had an intense interest in spirituality and the paranormal, which some say bordered on obsession. Sherilyn, too, reportedly dabbled in esoteric beliefs. Together they were planning a fresh start on a 40-acre plot of land in the mountains. But instead of a new beginning, the family walked into a mystery so baffling it still haunts investigators and armchair sleuths alike. On that October day, the Jamesons were reportedly scouting out the property they intended to purchase. Witnesses saw them in the area, but no one else seemed to be around. Their truck was later found abandoned, eerily locked, with their malnourished dog, Maisie, still alive inside. Inside the truck, investigators found Bobby's wallet, Sherilyn's purse, their jackets, a GPS unit, and a staggering $32,000 in cash hidden under the driver's seat. They also discovered Bobby's cell phone, which contained a photograph of Madison taken the day before they vanished. This photo, a haunting snapshot of the little girl looking uncomfortable, has fueled speculation that it might have been taken after her parents had already met their fate. Now, here's where the theories start piling up like pieces of a puzzle that just don't fit. 1. Cult connections. One of the most talked about theories is that the Jamesons were murdered by a cult. Sherilyn's mother, Connie Cocoton, believed the family was targeted by a religious cult operating in southeastern Oklahoma. She even claimed Sherilyn had been placed on a hit list by this mysterious group. Further adding to the intrigue, investigators discovered a witch's Bible in the Jameson home. However, a close family friend dismissed this as a joke, saying it was something Sherilyn had bought for laughs. But then there's the matter of Bobby's alleged dabbling in a satanic Bible and strange graffiti found on their property. Could they have gotten involved with the wrong people? Or were these signs of deeper personal struggles? 2. Drugs and the Mexican cartel. Early on, law enforcement speculated that drugs might have played a role. The family's strange behavior, captured on their home security cameras, only added fuel to this theory. In the footage, Bobby and Sherilyn appeared dazed, repeatedly walking back and forth to their truck with empty hands, as if in a trance. But here's where it gets murkier. While no drugs or paraphernalia were found at the scene, southeastern Oklahoma is known for methamphetamine activity. Some believe the Jamesons might have crossed paths with dangerous individuals involved in the drug trade, potentially even the Mexican cartel. If true, this could explain the large sum of cash found in their truck. Was it payment for something, or maybe a ransom that went horribly wrong? The KKK. Another sinister theory suggests the involvement of white supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan. Oklahoma has a history of such organizations operating in rural areas, and it's been suggested that the Jamisons, being an unconventional and private family, might have been targeted. Sherilyn's outspoken nature and her purchase of a hate sign meant to intimidate a neighbor could have put her on someone's radar. Could the family's deaths have been a hate crime disguised as a disappearance? A family feud. Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jamison, also became a prime suspect. Bobby had filed a protective order against him just 6 months before the family vanished, claiming his father had made violent threats and was involved with gangs and prostitutes. Bob Dean denied any involvement, and while investigators didn't have enough evidence to charge him, the family feud left a bitter trail of suspicion. Murder-suicide. Sherilyn's mental health also raised questions. She was bipolar and had a history of depression. Investigators found an 11-page hate letter she'd written to Bobby, and her gun was missing from the truck. Could Sherilyn have snapped, killing her husband and daughter before taking her own life? This theory gained traction but ultimately couldn't be proven, as her gun was never found, and the skeletal remains offered no definitive answers. 6. Lost in the wilderness. Some believe the family simply got lost in the dense, unforgiving terrain of the Sandsboa Mountains. Perhaps they succumbed to hypothermia or an accident. But with temperatures mild at the time, this theory also seems unlikely. It wasn't until November 2013, 4 years after their disappearance, that the Jamisons' skeletal remains were discovered just 3 miles from their abandoned truck. Hunters stumbled upon the remains of 2 adults and a child lying side by side. Due to the state of the remains and animal activity, the cause of death couldn't be determined. The coroner's report only deepened the mystery, stating that their deaths were under suspicious circumstances. And that's where this case stands, unsolved. Was it a cult ritual, a cartel hit, or simply a tragic accident? Did the KKK or a vengeful father play a role? Or is the answer hidden in those eerie, grainy security tapes of the family's final moments at home? The truth is, we may never know what happened to the Jamison family. But one thing's for sure, their story continues to captivate and confound, leaving us with more questions than answers. When it comes to unsolved mysteries, most of the time we're left with missing people or unanswered questions because those involved simply can't explain their disappearance. Either they're missing or no longer with us. But the Tromp family? They turned that expectation on its head. Every single one of them was found, yet their disappearance remains one of the strangest mysteries in modern Australian history. Let's dive into the bizarre and unsettling story of the Tromp family's road trip into chaos. The Tromps were, by all accounts, a normal, hard-working family. Mark and Jacoba Tromp lived with their 3 adult children, Rihanna, Mitchell, and Ella, in Sylvan, a small rural town just outside Melbourne. The family ran an 18-acre red currant farm and an earth-moving business. Neighbors described them as workaholics, always busy, always focused, and entirely devoted to their work. But nothing about them seemed unusual. That was until August 29, 2016. Without warning, the Tromps piled into Ella's silver SUV and vanished, leaving behind their phones, passports, credit cards, and any semblance of an explanation. All they took with them was a small pile of cash. From the outside, it looked like they were fleeing something or someone, but the truth would prove far more confusing. When relatives couldn't reach the family, they grew worried and called the Victorian police. What officers found at the Tromp farmhouse only deepened the mystery. The house was in disarray, as though someone had been frantically searching for something. Passports and credit cards were strewn across tables. The family's other vehicles were still parked with the keys in their ignitions, ready to go. It was as if the Tromps had dropped everything and fled in a panic. Then came the strangest clue of all. Mitchell, the middle child, had broken the family's no phones rule and brought his mobile along, but only briefly. About 30 kilometers from home, the phone was tossed out the car window. Police later found it on the roadside, abandoned. It seemed the Tromps believed they were being tracked. In the months leading up to their abrupt departure, there were subtle but growing signs of paranoia, especially in Mark and Jacoba. Friends and neighbors noted that the couple seemed increasingly convinced that someone was after them, perhaps trying to steal their money or even harm them. By the time they left, it seemed this fear had consumed them entirely. The Tromps' road trip wasn't exactly a well-thought-out plan. They drove aimlessly for hours before eventually arriving in Bathurst, nearly 800 kilometers from their farm. By the next morning, cracks in the family's unity began to show. Mitchell, seemingly the most skeptical of the paranoia gripping his family, had had enough. He left the group and caught a train back to Melbourne, leaving his parents and sisters behind. The remaining Tromps continued their journey, heading to the Jenolan Caves, a tourist hotspot in New South Wales. But tensions must have been high, because later that morning, the two sisters, Rihanna and Ella, also decided to leave. Unable to convince their parents to return home, the sisters took matters into their own hands. They stole a car and drove to Goulburn, where they reported their parents missing. It was in Goulburn that Ella and Rihanna made yet another strange decision. They separated. Ella drove home, becoming the first family member to return to Sylvan. When she arrived, she found herself swarmed by police and reporters, all desperate for answers. The media had picked up the story, and the mysterious disappearance of the Tromps was making headlines across Australia. Mitchell, too, eventually made it home by train. Together, he and Ella expressed confusion about what had happened, but were more concerned with finding the rest of their family. That same day, Rihanna was discovered in the back of a stranger's utility truck. The driver, Keith Whitaker, had been on his way to a doctor's appointment when he felt a kick against his seat. To his shock, Rihanna was curled up in the truck bed, completely catatonic. She had no idea where she was or how she'd gotten there. Keith called the police, and Rihanna was taken to a psychiatric facility for care. This bizarre turn of events captivated the public even further. The Tromp story was now national news, with headlines speculating on everything from cult activity to shared psychosis. Meanwhile, Mark and Jacoba had made their way 600 kilometers south to Wangaratta. By this point, the couple had also separated. Jacoba, disoriented and agitated, was eventually found wandering in the town of Yass. Like her daughter, she was taken to a hospital for evaluation. That left only Mark, who seemed to be the most consumed by paranoia. Reports emerged of a man fitting his description tailgating a couple in Wangaratta. When the couple pulled over, Mark stopped as well, stared at them, and then bolted into a nearby park. Around the same time, police discovered evidence of a break-in at a local motel where someone had apparently spent the night. Was it Mark? No one could say for sure. Thanksgiving. The word alone stirs up images of golden brown turkeys, steaming bowls of mashed potatoes, and the sound of laughter echoing through homes. It's a time of tradition, where families and friends gather around the dinner table, sharing stories, gratitude, and if you're lucky, that one relative's questionable casserole. Thanksgiving is often hailed as the ultimate celebration of togetherness, a day to pause and reflect on what we're grateful for. For many, it's the warm glow of love and comfort. But let's be real, holidays aren't picture-perfect for everyone. For some, Thanksgiving is more about awkward family feuds, burned pies, and dodging that one nosy aunt who just has to ask why you're still single. And then there's the darker side of the holiday. Beneath the facade of togetherness and joy, tensions simmer, secrets unravel, and sometimes, things take a chilling turn. While most of us are arguing over the last slice of pumpkin pie, others find themselves caught in nightmares they never saw coming. Today, we're diving into some of those stories, tales of Thanksgiving celebrations that ended in tragedy. These aren't your typical holiday dramas. These are the kind of stories that make you think twice about what's really happening behind closed doors. So grab your plate of leftovers and settle in. Because this episode is taking Thanksgiving to a place you never expected. Let's talk about the crimes, the mysteries, and the horrors that have marked this day of gratitude with anything but joy. Since Thanksgiving is upon us, I thought it'd be the perfect time to dive into a chilling true crime story tied to this holiday. A story so horrific and unexpected that it feels like the plot of a dark thriller. But sadly, this is no fiction. It's the story of Seth Privacki and a brutal family massacre that forever stained Thanksgiving in 1998. Let's rewind to that day, November 29th. It started like any other holiday, families coming together, sharing food, laughter, and warmth. For 19-year-old April Boss, the day was no different. She went over to her boyfriend Jedediah Privacki's house for a Thanksgiving meal with his family. They had planned a delayed celebration that Sunday, but as the hours stretched into the night, April's parents began to worry. They hadn't heard from her, and she wasn't answering her phone. Around midnight, uneasy and desperate for answers, they decided to drive over to the Privacki home. Imagine their dread as they pulled into the driveway. Cars sat eerily parked outside, but the house was silent. No lights, no sounds, no sign of life. Then they spotted something that sent a jolt of fear through their hearts. A shadowy figure darted into the house and then quickly out again. But even more horrifying, there were bloodstains on the driveway. And then they saw it, a lifeless body. That moment must have felt like stepping into a nightmare. Panicked and trembling, they called the police, who arrived within minutes. Officers checked the body. It was clear the person was dead. Fearing the killer might still be inside, they surrounded the house and waited. While securing the scene, one officer spotted a figure lurking in the woods nearby. That's when they arrested 18-year-old Stephen Wallace. At first, he seemed like a suspect, but he quickly confessed that his best friend, Seth Privacki, was the real perpetrator. With Stephen's cooperation, the police finally entered the house, and nothing could have prepared them for what they found. Inside the Privacki home, the officers were met with absolute carnage. Blood spattered the walls, and bodies were scattered throughout the house. Every room told a gruesome story. In total, they found 5 victims: Stephen and Linda Privacki, both in their late 40s, their elder son Jedediah, just 19 years old, Jed's girlfriend April, and Seth's grandfather, 78-year-old John Privacki. The youngest son, Seth, was nowhere to be found. The following morning, a manhunt was launched for 18-year-old Seth. His high school was placed on lockdown, and his photo was plastered all over the news. Meanwhile, people were still reeling from the unthinkable. The Privackis were a well-respected family, known for their kindness and close-knit bond. How could something so horrific happen? Here's where the story takes an almost surreal turn. While the police searched for Seth, a teenager named Jonna Simonelli was driving around town, shaken by the news. As she drove, she noticed a drenched hitchhiker on the side of the road. Feeling sorry for him, she stopped and offered him a ride. Now I know what you're thinking. No, Jonna, don't do it. But she didn't realize it was Seth Privacki until he was already in the car. Can you imagine her terror, stuck in a car with a mass murderer? But here's the incredible part. Jonna kept her cool. Pretending she didn't recognize him, she dropped him off at a friend's house and immediately called the police. By the end of the day, Seth was caught, hiding in a barn just a mile from his home. When arrested, he stayed completely silent, only requesting a lawyer. Now, let's dive into the big question: why? Why would an 18-year-old described as quiet and kind do something so monstrous? Even now, we don't have all the answers, but here's what we do know. Seth Privacki was born on June 2, 1980, in Michigan. He was the younger of 2 brothers in what seemed like a normal, loving family. His father, Stephen, was a well-liked 5th-grade teacher with 25 years of experience. His mother, Linda, worked as a receptionist at a medical office. They lived near Seth's grandfather, John, and were close-knit, at least on the surface. Seth, however, felt differently. In the months leading up to the murders, he became increasingly unhappy and withdrawn. He said he felt isolated and misunderstood. According to him, his father was often critical, and their arguments had escalated to the point where his dad threatened to kick him out of the house. He also claimed his mother and brother, once his allies, started siding with his dad. On that fateful Sunday, tensions boiled over. After a brief argument with his father, Stephen told Seth he needed to move out. That's when Seth snapped. While his dad went to pick up his grandfather, Seth loaded his father's .22 caliber Ruger and waited. One by one, he executed his entire family. First, his brother Jedediah, shot in the back of the head while watching TV. Then his father and grandfather ambushed in the garage. His mother Linda was killed as she stepped out of the shower. Finally, April Boss, who had arrived unexpectedly, was also shot. Each victim was killed with a single shot to the head, except for his grandfather, who was shot twice. Seth later claimed he had no intention of killing April, but his actions that day tell a different story. After the murders, Seth called his best friend, Stephen Wallace, for help cleaning up the scene. Stephen, who later claimed he acted out of fear, helped Seth wrap the bodies in sheets and attempt to stage the house to look like a robbery. But before they could finish, April's parents arrived, forcing the two to flee. In court, Seth admitted to the killings but gave little insight into his motives. At one point he said, "I never thought about killing my parents until that morning. It was all a mistake. I wish I could take it back." But this was contradicted by evidence showing he had tried to purchase ammunition the night before. Seth was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Over the years, he tried to explain his actions, blaming everything from drugs to his agnostic upbringing. But none of it really adds up, does it? The story ends in yet another shocking twist. On July 15, 2010, Seth attempted to escape from prison with two other inmates. They hijacked a semi-truck and tried to ram it through the prison fence. When the truck got stuck, Seth made a run for it, ignoring orders to stop. A corrections officer opened fire, killing him on the spot. And just like that, the story of Seth Pravacki came to a violent end. But the pain he caused lives on. That fatal Thanksgiving Day back in 1998 was supposed to be a day of gratitude and togetherness, a holiday celebrating family. Instead, 5 lives were stolen and countless others were shattered. Hey, sorry for the quick interruption, but if you enjoy these stories, it would help me out a lot. If you smash that like button, it helps to push these videos out. If you subscribe, that would be great. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and if there's any stories you would like me to cover. Right, back to the story. So Thanksgiving is supposed to be a day of gratitude, a time when families come together to celebrate love, life, and togetherness. It's a time for shared meals, laughter, and, let's be honest, sometimes awkward conversations with relatives you only see once or twice a year. Most of us have been there. Political debates with that one uncle who just won't let it go, or the cousin who brings up that embarrassing thing you did 5 years ago in front of the whole family. Usually those squabbles blow over, and by the end of the night, everyone's swapping leftovers and saying, "See you next year." But sometimes, family tensions simmer beneath the surface, unspoken and unresolved. And in rare, tragic cases, those tensions explode in unimaginable ways. That's exactly what happened to the Sitton family in 2009, a Thanksgiving celebration that turned into a nightmare they could never escape. Thanksgiving Day in Jupiter, Florida, started like any other. Muriel and Jim Sitton were hosting dinner for 16 of their closest family members at their beautiful upscale home. Among the guests were Muriel's parents, 79-year-old Ramon Joseph and her husband, Muriel's nieces, Lisa Knight and Carla Merhige, both 33 years old, Lisa's husband Patrick, and the Sittons' 6-year-old daughter, Michaela. It was the kind of gathering you'd see in a Hallmark movie. Food, family, and the kind of festive atmosphere that warms your soul. But beneath the surface, there was one name that cast a shadow over the evening. Paul Merhige, the 35-year-old estranged son of Michael Merhige, Muriel's brother. Paul hadn't been a part of the family's Thanksgiving celebrations for years, and for good reason. His history with his family was complicated. No, scratch that, toxic. Paul had once been a golden child. A straight-A student with dreams of becoming a doctor, he seemed destined for greatness. But somewhere along the way, things went terribly wrong. By the time he turned 20, Paul's life had unraveled. He suffered from severe mental health issues, including bouts of violent rage and emotional instability, that made it impossible for him to hold down a job or maintain healthy relationships. Over the years, Paul became more and more isolated, spiraling into paranoia and anger. He blamed everyone else, especially his two sisters, Lisa and Carla, for his failures. His resentment toward them grew so intense that Lisa once filed a restraining order against him, though it was later dropped. By his mid-30s, Paul was entirely dependent on his parents, who had bought him a condo just to get him out of their house. Even then, they had to hire someone to monitor whether he was taking his medication. Paul's violent outbursts weren't just a vague concern, they were a recurring reality. Police had been called to his parents' home numerous times over the years, and he had been involuntarily committed to psychiatric facilities on 3 occasions. Yet despite all of these red flags, Paul's father, Michael, decided to invite him to Thanksgiving dinner. Without consulting anyone else, he gave Paul directions to the Sitton's house. When Muriel found out her nephew was on his way, she reportedly turned to her sister Lisa and jokingly said, "I hope he doesn't kill us all." It was a dark comment meant in jest, but tragically, it would prove to be horrifyingly prophetic. When Paul arrived, everyone braced themselves. But to their surprise, things seemed fine. He joined the family for dinner, engaged in conversation, and even watched as Carla played the piano while the family sang Christmas carols. Little Michaela, the Sitton's only child, stole the spotlight with a dance she was rehearsing for a performance the next day. For a brief moment, it seemed like Paul had left his demons at the door. But what the family didn't know was that Paul had been planning this massacre for weeks. He had withdrawn $12,000 from a savings account his parents had set up for him and spent part of it purchasing guns and ammunition. In his mind, this wasn't just a spontaneous outburst. It was premeditated. After Michaela went to bed, Paul quietly excused himself and walked out to his car. When he returned, he was armed with a handgun. Without warning, he opened fire. Paul's first victim was his 79-year-old Aunt Ramond, who died instantly. Next, he turned his gun on his sisters, Carla and Lisa, fatally shooting both of them. As Lisa's husband, Patrick, rushed to her side, Paul shot him as well. Patrick survived, but he spent the next 3 months in a medically induced coma. By now, the other family members had scattered in terror, some hiding in the kitchen while Jim and Muriel frantically called 911. But Paul wasn't done. He made his way down the hallway to Michaela's room, where the little girl lay sleeping. He fired 3 shots, killing her just days before her 7th birthday. As he walked back through the house, Paul coldly remarked, "I've been waiting 20 years to do this," before getting into his car and driving away. The attack lasted only a few minutes, but its effects shattered the Sitton family forever. 4 people were dead, and Patrick Knight was critically injured. The survivors were left to grapple with their grief, trauma, and the horrifying question of how this could have been prevented. Law enforcement launched a manhunt for Paul, who fled the scene in a blue Toyota Camry. For a month, he eluded capture. A $100,000 reward was offered for information, and the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. That broadcast proved to be the break authorities needed. A motel owner in Long Key, Florida, recognized Paul from the show and tipped off the FBI. On January 2, 2010, federal agents arrested him in his motel room. Paul had shaved his head in an attempt to disguise himself, but there was no mistaking him. Paul was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, and prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. But in 2011, just weeks before his trial was set to begin, Paul accepted a plea deal. In exchange for pleading guilty and waiving his right to appeal, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. Paul was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The plea deal sparked mixed reactions. Jim and Muriel Sitton, who had lost their beloved Michaela, were devastated. They had prepared themselves for a trial and wanted Paul to face the ultimate punishment. Others, like Patrick Knight, felt differently. After losing his wife and enduring months of physical recovery, he supported the plea deal, hoping it would bring closure. In the years since the massacre, the Sitton and Merhija families have been irreparably fractured. Jim and Muriel filed a civil suit against Paul's parents, accusing them of negligence for inviting him to Thanksgiving. The case was ultimately dismissed, but the emotional scars remain. Paul Merhige now sits in a Florida prison where he will spend the rest of his life. For the surviving family members, the pain of that night will never fully fade. The memories of love and laughter have been overshadowed by the haunting loss of those they held most dear. Thanksgiving will never be the same for them or for anyone who hears their story. This story was really sad to research, as are many others. But to take the life of a 6-year-old girl is just soul-destroying. I can't even begin to imagine how those parents felt, still feel. It is every parent's worst nightmare. I would have wanted the death sentence too, so I could understand their disappointment in the plea deal. But I also feel death is too easy. At least he will die in prison and never be released. I only hope they can take some comfort in that. Thanksgiving is a time for family, a time to gather, give thanks, and celebrate the bonds that tie us together. For the Guy family of Knoxville, Tennessee, Thanksgiving 2016 was particularly poignant. Lisa and Joel Guy Sr., the family's matriarch and patriarch, had decided it was time to retire after decades of hard work. They were ready to sell their suburban Knoxville home, move closer to family in Burgonsville, and finally enjoy a simpler, quieter life. But what should have been the start of a new chapter turned into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. Joel and Lisa had been married for 31 years, blending their lives into a family that included Joel Sr.'s 3 children from a previous marriage and their youngest, Joel Michael Guy Jr. Despite the typical challenges of raising a blended family, Joel and Lisa worked hard to provide for their children. They were the epitome of the American dream: stable jobs, a nice home, and dreams for a secure retirement. But like many families, their unity was tested by complex dynamics. Joel Guy Jr., the youngest of the family, stood out from his siblings in more ways than one. While his older half-sisters and half-brother built lives of independence, Joel Jr. remained a stark contrast, reclusive, dependent, and as many would later say, deeply out of touch with reality. At 28 years old, he had spent much of his adult life as a perpetual student at Louisiana State University. Despite being enrolled for years, he had no degree to show for it and had never held down a job. Instead, he relied entirely on his parents, who funded his apartment, utilities, and other expenses, an arrangement that created resentment among his siblings, though they rarely expressed it openly. The decision to cut Joel Jr. off financially came as a shock to him, but for Joel Sr. and Lisa, it was necessary. After years of enabling their youngest son, they saw their impending retirement as a time to let go of their financial obligations. What they didn't see was how deeply their decision had affected Joel Jr. He didn't complain, didn't argue, at least not directly, but inside he was stewing, plotting, and preparing for the unthinkable. The Guy family's Thanksgiving in 2016 was supposed to be one of their last in the Knoxville home. Joel Sr. and Lisa hosted their children and grandchildren for a traditional dinner. The air was filled with the warmth of shared memories, but looking back, there were subtle cracks in the surface. Joel Jr.'s presence was particularly surprising. He hadn't announced that he'd be making the long drive from Baton Rouge to Knoxville, and for someone who was usually distant, his sudden effort to engage with family was unusual. Joel Jr. spent the weekend reconnecting with his nieces and nephews, giving away childhood toys and making small talk. His half-siblings, though polite, couldn't help but find his behavior odd. Joel Jr. was never the sentimental type, and his attempts at generosity felt hollow. But no one voiced their concerns. After all, Thanksgiving is about togetherness, not airing grievances. Beneath Joel Jr.'s calm exterior, however, his mind was working overtime. Unknown to anyone else, he had meticulously planned the events that were about to unfold. A notebook later found in his possession revealed his chilling intent: kill his parents, stage the crime to look like a domestic dispute, and use chemical means to dispose of their bodies. He had calculated everything, from the amount of corrosive chemicals needed to dissolve human tissue to the exact temperature required to expedite decomposition. On Saturday, November 26, Joel Jr. put his plan into action. Lisa had gone out to shop for groceries, leaving Joel Sr. alone in the house with his son. It was then that Joel Jr. struck. In the upstairs exercise room, a violent struggle erupted. Joel Sr., who was 61 years old and recovering from surgery, fought valiantly to defend himself. Evidence of the fight was everywhere: the overturned Bowflex machine, blood spatter on the walls, and damage to the blinds. But ultimately, Joel Jr.'s youth and rage overpowered his father. He stabbed him over 40 times, each wound a grotesque expression of his pent-up fury. When Lisa returned home, she barely had time to put the groceries down before Joel Jr. attacked her as well. He stabbed her with such ferocity that 9 of her ribs were severed. The assault was gruesome, methodical, and deeply personal. It was clear Joel Jr. didn't just want his parents dead, he wanted to obliterate them. What followed was a scene straight out of a horror movie. Joel Jr. began dismembering his parents' bodies, cutting their arms, legs, and torsos into manageable pieces. He placed the body parts in large plastic bins filled with corrosive chemicals, intending to dissolve them completely. Lisa's head was severed and placed in a pot on the stove, which he left simmering. The air in the house became thick with the sickly smell of decomposition and chemicals, a horrifying testament to the sheer brutality of the act. Joel Jr. had brought everything he needed to execute his plan, from industrial-strength cleaning supplies to tools for dismemberment. But in his frenzy, he made crucial mistakes. He injured himself during the attack, leaving his own blood at the scene. Surveillance footage from a local Walmart later showed him purchasing medical supplies to treat his wounds, his hands heavily bandaged. By Monday, Lisa's coworkers became alarmed when she didn't show up for work. She was retiring in just a few days, and her absence was highly unusual. Concerned, they contacted the police for a welfare check. When officers arrived at the Guy home, the scene that greeted them was beyond comprehension. The front door was unlocked, and the house was eerily quiet. Inside, the heat was stifling, likely due to the chemical reactions taking place upstairs. In the master bathroom, investigators found the dismembered remains of Joel Sr. and Lisa. The tubs of corrosive chemicals were still bubbling, and Lisa's head was simmering on the stove. Blood covered the walls and floors, a chilling reminder of the violence that had taken place. For Joel Jr.'s siblings, the discovery was devastating. Not only had they lost their father and beloved stepmother in the most horrific way imaginable, but they also had to grapple with the fact that their youngest brother, a man they had shared holidays and childhood memories with, was responsible. His half-sister Michelle later described feeling a mix of grief and disbelief, saying, "We knew he was odd, but we never thought he was capable of this." During Joel Jr.'s trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence in harrowing detail. The jury was shown his notebook, which outlined his plans step by step, as well as the surveillance footage of his Walmart trip. Despite his attempts to appear emotionless, the sheer weight of the evidence made it clear this was a premeditated, calculated crime. Joel Jr. showed no remorse throughout the proceedings. His siblings sat in stunned silence as the gruesome details of their father and stepmother's murders were recounted. In the end, Joel Jr. was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the Guy family, the pain of Joel Jr.'s actions is immeasurable. His half-siblings have spoken about the deep betrayal they feel, not only for the loss of their father and Lisa, but for the realization that someone they shared their lives with was capable of such evil. Joel Jr.'s crimes left scars that will never fully heal, a dark legacy that overshadows the memory of a once loving family. I can't even begin to imagine how on earth you would get over something like this. Honestly, the brutality in which he took his own parents' lives is just harrowing. Just days from retiring and about to enjoy their freedom, and your own son does this to you. So evil. I would haunt him for the rest of his days. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hug and love you family this Thanksgiving. It was a chilly afternoon on November 23, 2006, when Memphis Rescue Services received a call at 3:46 p.m. Now, it's no secret that emergencies don't take holidays, but even seasoned dispatchers are sometimes caught off guard. The operator who answered that day was stunned, not by the situation itself, but by the unsettling calm of the caller. The man on the line introduced himself as Jeffrey Scott. His tone was flat, almost robotic, as he explained that his wife, Ashley, had been unconscious since 11 a.m. But before the dispatcher could even process that, another voice in the background interjected, "She's probably already dead." The dispatcher pressed for clarification. Jeffrey then casually remarked, "She was breathing a second ago," with the same emotion you'd use to discuss the weather. It was enough to send alarm bells ringing in the operator's mind. Something about this call wasn't right. Emergency services and law enforcement rushed to the address Jeffrey provided. When officers arrived, Jeffrey met them at the door and led them to the bedroom where his wife, Ashley Scott, lay lifeless on the bed. A man hovered over her, attempting resuscitation. He introduced himself as Dr. Robert McGee, a family friend. McGee informed the responders that Ashley was still alive, but barely clinging to life, with extremely low blood pressure and shallow breaths. The responding medics quickly assessed the situation and found Ashley's condition critical. She was bleeding from her nose and mouth, her pupils were dilated and unresponsive to light, and her body bore the telltale signs of violence. Bruises and abrasions covered her chest, legs, and back. Despite their best efforts, the team couldn't revive her. They rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. By the time she arrived, Ashley was in the final stages of brain death. At just 28 years old, her life was slipping away. The decision was made to remove her from life support. Ashley Scott was gone. Doctors and investigators didn't need much time to figure out that Ashley's injuries were not the result of an accident. Her right ear was bruised, a mark often seen in cases of repeated trauma, like a boxer enduring countless punches. There was even an imprint of a man's shoe on her back, a haunting detail that spoke volumes about the violence she endured. Further examination revealed bruises in various stages of healing, indicating that this wasn't a one-time incident. Ashley had been suffering for a long time. As the investigation began, Jeffrey Scott's behavior continued to raise suspicions. He told officers that he and Ashley had been drinking the night before, had an argument, and she went to bed, but didn't wake up the next morning. According to him, it was Dr. McGee who convinced him to call 911 after finding Ashley unresponsive. But detectives weren't buying Jeffrey's story. The evidence in the home painted a different picture. The house was in disarray, with signs of a struggle in nearly every room. Furniture was overturned, a vase lay shattered on the floor, and printed messages between Ashley and another man were found on the kitchen table, messages that confirmed Ashley had been having an affair. In the garage, officers made an even more chilling discovery. Bloodstains on the floor of Ashley's car, along with her belongings, including a purse containing her passport and other personal documents. It seemed Ashley had been planning to leave. She had packed, she was ready, but she didn't get the chance. To understand what led to this tragedy, investigators began speaking with Ashley's friends and family. What they uncovered painted a harrowing picture of a young woman trapped in an abusive relationship. Born Ashley Pittman on November 4, 1978, in Bossier City, Louisiana, Ashley had a tough childhood. Her parents divorced when she was young, and though her father, Jimmy Pittman, adored her, the instability of her early years left its mark. Despite these challenges, Ashley grew into a kind and ambitious young woman. She graduated high school in 1996 and enrolled at Baptist University in Arkansas, where she met Jeffrey Scott. At first, Jeffrey seemed like a dream come true. Handsome, charming, and ambitious, he swept Ashley off her feet. They married in 2001, and Ashley's friends envied her seemingly perfect life. But behind closed doors, Jeffrey's true nature began to show. Over the years, Jeffrey became controlling and emotionally abusive, isolating Ashley from her family and friends. She stopped reaching out, withdrew from social events, and kept her struggles hidden. To the outside world, she was a dedicated English teacher, beloved by her students and colleagues. But at home, she was trapped in a toxic and dangerous marriage. By September 2006, Ashley had reached her breaking point. She had secretly contacted a divorce lawyer and began making plans to leave Jeffrey. Friends like Lori, who had reconnected with Ashley after years of estrangement, noticed her growing fear and anxiety. Lori recalled that Ashley hinted at the abuse but was too afraid to fully open up. Then, Ashley met Michael Lowe. The two began a whirlwind romance, exchanging messages that gave Ashley hope for a better future. Michael encouraged her to leave Jeffrey and promised to support her. But when Jeffrey discovered the messages, his anger boiled over. The night before Ashley's death, Jeffrey confronted her with printouts of the messages. What followed was a violent, brutal attack that ended in Ashley's death. She spent her final hours lying on the cold garage floor, bleeding and unconscious, while Jeffrey waited hours before seeking help. Jeffrey Scott's trial began in January 2009. The prosecution argued that this was a premeditated murder, pointing to the clear evidence of prolonged abuse and the violent struggle that occurred in the Scott home. Ashley's divorce lawyer testified, revealing that Ashley had been ready to leave but wanted to speak with Jeffrey one last time, a decision that proved fatal. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the jury found Jeffrey guilty of second-degree murder, not first-degree. He was sentenced to just 20 years in prison with no possibility of parole. For Ashley's family, the verdict was a devastating blow. In the wake of Ashley's death, her father, Jimmy, channeled his grief into action. He established a charitable foundation in Ashley's memory, providing support and resources to victims of domestic violence. The foundation has since helped hundreds of women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives, ensuring that Ashley's story continues to inspire hope and change. Ashley Scott's life was cut tragically short, but her story serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of domestic violence. Her bravery, her resilience, and her determination to escape will never be forgotten. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, know that help is out there. Ashley's story, though heartbreaking, is also a beacon of hope for those who feel trapped. Let her legacy remind us all to fight for justice and support those in need. So let's dive into a case that's as gruesome as it is unbelievable. A story of abuse, manipulation, and cannibalism. Yes, you heard that right. This is the story of Omaima Ari Nelson, a woman whose turbulent beginnings led her down a path of violence so shocking it made headlines worldwide, and it all came to a head during the Thanksgiving weekend of 1991. So grab your popcorn, or maybe not for this one. Let's get into it. Omaima Ari Nelson was born in 1968 in a small, impoverished village near the Sudanese border in southern Egypt. Her childhood was a nightmare of suffering. Raised in a household ruled by violence, Omaima's father was abusive in every sense of the word, physically, emotionally, and even sexually tormenting his wife and children. But one event from Omaima's childhood stands out as particularly horrific. At the age of 7, she was forced to undergo female genital mutilation, or FGM. For those who aren't familiar, FGM is a barbaric practice performed to control a woman's sexuality, often using crude tools and without any anesthesia. For Omaima, this traumatic ordeal left lifelong scars, both physical and emotional. It made intimacy agonizing and planted the seeds of trauma that would haunt her throughout her life. Eventually, her mother found the courage to leave Omaima's father, and the family relocated to Cairo. They ended up in the City of the Dead, a sprawling slum built among the graves of Cairo's ancient cemetery. Despite the morbid name, this area had become a haven for Cairo's poorest, with entire families living among tombstones. Life there was bleak and filled with hardship, but Omaima grew into a striking young woman, physically stunning, with sharp features that would later become her ticket out of the slums. At 18, Omaima met an older American oil worker who promised her a better life in the United States. With her family's encouragement, she married him in 1986 and moved to Texas. But the American dream turned out to be anything but dreamy. The marriage fell apart quickly, for reasons that remain unclear, and Omaima found herself stranded, alone in a foreign country, with little money, no marketable skills, and limited English. Desperate to survive, Omaima turned to her looks. She bounced between jobs as a nanny, maid, and even a part-time model. But these gigs weren't enough to pay the bills, and soon Omaima found herself drifting into darker territory. She began targeting older, wealthy men, using her beauty to manipulate and eventually rob them. Her methods grew increasingly violent. According to one ex-boyfriend, Robert Hansen, Omaima tied him to a chair, pulled out a shotgun, and demanded money. Thankfully, he managed to escape, but the encounter left him shaken. Omaima was becoming more dangerous, moving from man to man, town to town, leaving a trail of theft and terror in her wake. In 1991, at the age of 23, Omaima ended up in Orange County, California, where she met her ultimate target, William Bill Nelson. Bill was 56 years old, a towering Texan at 6'4" and 230 pounds, with a larger-than-life personality to match. A former pilot, Bill had served time in federal prison for smuggling drugs and electronics across the Mexican border. But despite his criminal past, he was described by friends and family as a generally good guy, charismatic, generous, and always ready with a joke. Omaima and Bill's relationship moved fast, dangerously fast. They met at a bar, and within a month, they were married. Their wedding was a casual affair, first officiated over the phone by an Egyptian priest, and later made official at a courthouse in Phoenix. From there, they embarked on a whirlwind honeymoon road trip through Texas and Arkansas. Bill introduced Omaima to his family during this trip, and while they found her tough and no-nonsense, they had no idea just how dangerous she really was. By the time they returned to Bill's Costa Mesa apartment in California, the honeymoon phase was over, literally and figuratively. Bill Nelson called his daughter Margaret shortly before Thanksgiving to invite her to dinner with him and Omaima. Margaret declined, and that was the last time she ever heard her father's voice. On December 1st, 1991, Omaima showed up at the home of an ex-boyfriend, Jose Esquivel, in the early hours of the morning. She was hysterical, covered in cuts, and claimed her husband had been abusing her for days. She told Jose she'd killed Bill in self-defense, dismembered his body, and needed help disposing of it. Omaima offered Jose $75,000 and 2 motorcycles in exchange for his help. Jose wisely told her to wait while he got his truck. Instead, he called 911. When police arrived at Bill Nelson's apartment, they found a scene straight out of a horror movie. The bedroom was soaked in blood, with broken furniture and signs of a violent struggle. In the bathroom, they discovered Bill's torso, skinned and hanging from coat hangers over the bathtub. In the kitchen, things were even worse. Bill's hands were found frying in a pan, cooked alongside pieces of Thanksgiving turkey. His head was in the freezer, wrapped in tin foil and deep-fried. Investigators also found trash bags filled with dismembered body parts, and a garbage disposal clogged with human flesh. In total, Bill's body was missing over 100 pounds of flesh and bone. Neighbors reported hearing the garbage disposal running non-stop over the weekend until it broke. And chillingly, Omaima later claimed she had prepared Bill's ribs in a restaurant-style manner, describing them as sweet. She also hinted at making stew from his tongue and soup from his eyes. Omaima was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During the trial, her defense team attempted to frame her as a victim of lifelong abuse. They argued that she suffered from severe PTSD due to years of trauma, claiming that Bill had physically and sexually assaulted her during their brief marriage. Omaima even alleged that he once threw her cat out of a moving car, painting a picture of a volatile and dangerous relationship. But the evidence presented in court was damning. Bill's injuries told a story of overkill. He had been stabbed more than 25 times. Forensic experts testified that much of the dismemberment and mutilation occurred after he was already dead, undermining any claims of self-defense. Witnesses also recalled Omaima's bizarre and chilling behavior in the aftermath, including her alleged offer to pay for help in disposing of Bill's remains and her confession about eating parts of his body. The most emotional testimony came from Bill's daughter, Margaret, who described the devastating impact of her father's murder. Margaret, who had been close to her father, was in court to face the woman who had not only taken his life but also desecrated his body in ways almost too gruesome to comprehend. She shared her pain and disbelief, speaking about how her father had trusted Omaima and truly wanted to help her. Margaret's heartbreak was palpable as she expressed how this crime had robbed her of her sense of safety and trust in others. She painted a picture of Bill as a kind and generous man who didn't deserve such a brutal end. In 1993, the jury found Omaima guilty of second-degree murder, a slightly reduced charge. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. Omaima's life behind bars took a strange turn when, during her incarceration, she married a much older man in his 70s. This wealthy individual reportedly visited her regularly for conjugal visits, some lasting up to 3 days at a time. When questioned, the man claimed he never felt nervous or afraid of Omaima, a statement that baffled many given the brutality of her crime. After his death, Omaima inherited a substantial sum of money from him. While the exact amount remains unclear, reports suggest it was enough to ensure her financial stability even behind bars, a deeply ironic twist considering her violent history. To this day, Omaima continues to seek parole, though she has been denied multiple times, most recently in 2011. Her next parole meeting will be in 2026. Parole boards have consistently cited her lack of remorse and the extreme violence of her crime as reasons to keep her incarcerated. For the family of Bill Nelson, including Margaret, Omaima's continued attempts at freedom serve as painful reminders of a loss they'll never truly overcome. Omaima Nelson's story is one of the most chilling examples of how a lifetime of abuse and trauma can twist a person's psyche. Was she a victim lashing out in self-defense, or a cold-blooded predator who saw her husband as nothing more than her next meal? Perhaps it's a little of both. Either way, her story is one that will haunt you long after the credits roll. Thanks for listening to Thanksgiving Horrors with Midnight, Murder, and Mystery. If you enjoyed this episode, or if it kept you up at night, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, stay safe, and maybe skip the ribs at your next Thanksgiving dinner. Good night and sweet dreams.